This session we're going to talk with Al Bielek about being Al Bielek. And the best place to start was his very first memories. When he was a young child, I believe, Al, during Christmas? Is that your first memory?
It was Christmas of 1927.
1927.
And I was sitting, I presume would be the right way to put it, as a baby about 9 months old, on Mother's grand piano. She was a musician. And for this Christmas party, which was in Jamaica, New York, quite a few relatives were invited and friends, and were exchanging presents of various kinds. And there was a little Christmas tree, one of these things that it's about 18 inches high on top of the grand piano. It was taller than I was.
What was your mother's name?
Albertina Henrietta Kirchhoff's maiden name, Bielek married name.
Mm-hmm. And what was your dad's name?
Arthur E. Bielek, Arthur Ernest Bielek. And the marriage was arranged. There was of two musicians, so to speak, though music from my father, and I say, of course, father. I didn't know that he was anything but my father until many, many years later. Mm-hmm. I also was a graduate of Brooklyn Polytechnic, mechanical engineering, but he also maintained his interest in music for quite some years, and it's probably because of that he met the woman I knew as my mother, Albertina Bielek, because she was a graduate of the Institute of Musical Art in New York, which was then associated with and is now part of Juilliard School of Music.
Well, let's go back. You were physically Al Bielek, but it was the same physical body of Ed Cameron at the time that was regressed?
That is correct. I was a shrunken version of Ed Cameron, physical age regression. People throw up their hands when they hear this, but I've seen it happen to many people. I know of it happening to many people.
Did you ever get any hint from your mom and dad that you were adopted or you weren't their real child?
No, there was never any indication of this. I believe after I was inserted in the family as a substitute for a real Al Bielek who was supposed to have died, I got that from my mother before she died, about 4 months before she did. She remembered part of it. And the part she remembered was when she looked at me blankly one day in the nursing home and said, "The baby's dead, isn't it?" Now that might not be so significant in the average family, but there were no known brothers or sisters, and I'd spent a lot of time and effort trying to find out if I had a brother or sister because I was certain I had a brother. As a fact, I did, but it was not in the Bielek family. And she denied, they all denied, the whole family denied they ever had a brother or sister. I was an only. However...
are you saying that the baby that they had actually died?
I don't
and you
know
were
as
replaced.
A fact that the baby actually died. That was the story which I was given, and that was apparently what my legal mother remembered. Now, the baby obviously got sick and disappeared into the hospital, was taken care of, or something happened there, and they reported back to mother that the baby had died. And they went looking for a substitute, and apparently there was a substitute available as an adoption, and that was me. Very neatly and adroitly arranged, of course, with various people, and of course everybody got a brainwashing later to make sure they didn't remember any part of this whole procedure.
Yeah, what was the physical way that they brainwashed you, though? Was it that the drug they injected in you, or was it some other process? How did they do that?
That is still largely an unknown. There are drugs which will wipe your memory.
But how do you select what memory to wipe?
Well, in my case, as Ed Cameron, they wanted to wipe everything. So that wasn't so difficult to do. They wanted to totally wipe the board of any memory of Ed Cameron so that after his age regressed and grew back up as Al Bielek, having been plugged in the family, all I would remember was that I was Al Bielek. I was when I was old enough to know my name and know the usual things a kid learns. And
so you don't remember the exact process they used to wipe your memory out?
Other than the one shot and the fact that the electronics alone might have done that, I'm not sure. That I cannot answer with any certainty.
Okay.
Now, one of the discrepancies that turned up, and it didn't, let us say, poke its nose up, wave a flag at me until decades later, at that first memory of the Christmas party in 1927 of the Bieleks, there were all these people around. Of course, I learned later who they were, but they were all talking. And the recollection I have is that I understood virtually everything they said. Now, when does a 9-month-old baby understand everything that adults are saying? It doesn't happen unless there's something slightly unusual about that individual.
If they're regressed back, then
Yeah.
they do. So you understood the whole, but obviously
I
you
understood
could not.
nearly everything, but there were blanks.
But you couldn't speak it though.
No, I couldn't speak then.
Okay.
I was able to speak much earlier than the 2 years plus when I was caught one day talking into one of these toy telephones, which is a kid's toy, by my father, when I didn't want anybody to know that I understood the language and could talk but didn't feel like talking. I mean, I had literally my own little thing going in which I had decided I wasn't going to speak until I was ready to. I knew how to.
Kind of a stubborn streak there.
You might say that. You might say that.
So when did you start talking?
Just before I was 3, according to my folks.
And were you talking like you and I are talking right now?
I was talking like a kid would, but I was talking in normal language and sentences.
Huh.
And that was established quite early.
So you were apparently the boy wonder genius at that time.
In some respects, that was true. I remember many little incidents of that period when folks were still living in Jamaica. When I used to go around the neighborhood and I ran into other kids. I was a little older than 3 then, but I remember quite a bit about the neighborhood and things people were saying. But all of it didn't all come together until quite a bit later. And the sequence of events was I was born in Jamaica. We lived there approximately a year and a half in that particular address. Then folks moved over to Paterson, New Jersey for some reason or other. We were there about 2 years. And I remember a number of incidents from there. Then they moved to Long Island because my father got the idea he wanted to get into the gasoline business and gas station with his father, my legal grandfather. So they opened this little gas station on Sunrise Highway, which started to go well for a while. I do remember them making comments as though if we keep making money like this, we may get rich. Well, something went sour. I did not understand at that point what it was, but I know now what it was. I only knew that the business fell off and they were moaning and groaning about lack of money. And finally they had to close the business.
What was it that caused their business to go into decline?
The problem was that about 2 blocks down the street, somebody opened up a competitive station and totally undercut them on price.
Oh.
It was a price war. Put them out of business. Why, I don't know. I have no understanding then, and I don't know now whether there's any significance to that or not. It was just plain business, dirty business.
Mm-hmm.
From there, we moved to Brooklyn, and with my mother's parents, my grandfather, Curtis, and his wife were there, living in the upper floor of the very famous address at 2333 Foster Avenue. Famous to me, that is. And that's when I first started to go to grade school, and going up through first into the 5th grade.
What did your dad do at that time in Brooklyn?
In Brooklyn, he did a number of things. He was basically teaching still at Polytechnic and at the Institute of Mechanical Art in New York. I remember that. And then when he lost those jobs, he was looking for something else. He wound up working in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, of all places, as an inspector, mechanical parts inspector. The significance of that, of course, there was no meaning for me at that time that it had any significance, but there was a significance of that in terms of my whole life. At the Brooklyn Navy Yard was where, in essence, the Philadelphia experiment began.
Again, let's go back. What year was this that you were moved into? I mean, you went from 53 to what year when you were 9 months old? What year was that?
In 53, I was transferred to 83, and then I went back to 1927. My birth certificate, as Al Bielek says, that I was born on 31 March 1927. Now, I'm certain there was a real Al Bielek. But
you think he may have died or been moved on?
I do not know if he died or was removed and moved on to elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
That's still something of an unknown. I have a feeling that he did not die, that was just another story told to my parents by the nurse or whomever had set this thing up.
Okay.
In any case, we moved to Brooklyn. I started going to school. At that time, I was still a little bit on the aggressive side. It was in Brooklyn where suddenly things flipped and I became very compliant, very passive, if you will. And instead of being the bully, I was the bullied.
Well, that's normal.
Yeah, it's normal in a sense.
Yeah. Part of growing up.
But I was rather outspoken in class in school, and actually I did quite well in school up to the point of the 5th grade. And then some things went haywire. I'm still not yet fully aware of all of the implications, all of the inputs, if you will. But I became terribly fearful, psychically fearful of something in the house there at Foster Avenue. And it was driving me bananas. I dropped out of school. Parents took me out of school. They took me to a doctor. The doctor said, he has sinusitis dance, which was a medical term then for saying that the person was very agitated and nervously unstable, and that was just a term they used which may or may not have had a medical basis. In terms of what I know now, it probably didn't have a medical basis. But
I think they call that ADD now.
I think they've changed the name since. Yes,
something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
That was the accepted terminology then in 1936, 37, so forth.
You became somewhat paranoid
Yeah.
at something that was in your house, right?
Right.
Did you ever find out what that was or what the significance of that was?
The true significance of that I'm not sure of yet even now.
Did it finally just move on?
Oh, it didn't. We did.
Oh, you moved out of the house.
We moved out of the house, and folks packed up and moved to New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't like New York anyway, particularly Flatbush area. Didn't like New York at all. I kept having recurring dreams of a huge flood sinking New York City underwater and that sort of thing.
How old were you at that time?
This started about the age of, I would say those dreams started about the age of 7.
Mm-hmm.
Thereabouts. And then when we left in 1937, of course, I was 10 years old, and we went to New Jersey. I loved it over there. Went to Tenafly, New Jersey. And I was eventually re-entered into the school system. And since I seemed to be fairly brilliant, in the school system of New Jersey, they completely ignored the fact that I never went to 5th grade except for a few weeks, and put me into the 6th grade. And I fit very well, not only with the age bracket of the kids, but also in terms of the academic material. And I might add, the academic material in the schools then was so far beyond what they teach now, there's no comparison. I mean, we learned real history as it was. They still taught history in those days. Social studies, and we had rather controversial books on subjects of social studies and social movements and all of that. We studied all of that. We had to learn a language in high school.
What language did you learn?
I started out with Spanish and then switched to German.
Mm.
I never really mastered either one.
Okay, so you went through high school?
Just jumping ahead here.
Okay.
We moved to Tenafly, New Jersey, and I went through the grade school and into junior high there, because they did have the 633 system in New Jersey. And in the middle of junior high, the folks decided to move from there to Tenafly to Nutley, New Jersey, which is more built up. And, of course, I went to school there. I was considered, in those days, in Nutley, in junior high and elsewhere, I had some various names I was called, but one of them, which I remember stuck, was I was called, quote, the walking encyclopedia, unquote, even then. And was considered fairly brilliant. I was also fairly weak at that time physically, so I was continuing to be occasionally bullied. But aside from that, I was doing quite well in school. And we remained, let's see, sequence of events was we went to Nutley, I went to one house in the east side of the town, which was right across the street from the park. That was on 21 High Street. And after the war was over, World War II, and I came back from the Navy, it was sometime shortly after that, Because my mother was still teaching piano and doing well at it, and father was doing various things. He finally left the Navy Yard. He was working at various industrial companies around New Jersey. They moved and bought a house. They were renting there at 21 High Street. They bought a house at 359 High Street on the other side of town. And that house was where I lived until I left the East Coast. And that was all right, that house. But it was interesting that in that period of time, I developed an aversion to the usual assignments of homework, which was very common then. I don't know what they do now, but at that time there was lots of homework to take home, 2 or 3 hours a night. And I got very upset about it, and cussing up and down. My parents got tired of my getting upset about it. They pulled me out of Nutley High School and put me in Bloomfield Vocational High School. Oh, I was pissed over that. I was really upset. And the director of it, the admitting vice principal, thought I was going to be another one of the problem kids, because that school was filled up with nothing but problem kids of one kind or another. Most of them being misplaced something or others, misplaced criminals to be, misplaced from one thing or another, none of them having very much brains. A few they did. And they soon found out that I was definitely one of the brains in the school. So I got along with everybody at that point, and I went through radio school. I did a number of things. They had various different setups there in the vocational thing. I graduated. Actually, I didn't graduate from there until after the war was over, because I was pulled out to go in the Navy when the war was still on, but I came back afterwards. It gave me a QED.
What'd you do in the Navy?
Electronics. I was an electronic technician. I went to the Navy school. I was the only one in the entire high school in Nutley, New Jersey. Wait a minute, was it Nutley or was it in Bloomfield? It's Bloomfield where I took the test. During the war years, they were looking for people who had aptitude in electronics to be part of the electronics schools founded by Navy Captain Eddy. There was a man who got quite a lot of notoriety, good notoriety at that time, for the fact that he was something of a genius in electronics himself. And he set up the electronics training schools for the Navy, starting at the Chicago Pier in Chicago. And, of course, the training schools were all around Chicago at that time. And he set up a standardized test, which went not only through the Navy, it went into the schools, literally, all over the United States. Anyone who thinks they might have an aptitude for electronics and might be interested in a career in the Navy or something like that is welcome to take this test.
And you took it.
And I took it. I was the only one that passed it in the whole school. I thought some of the others would pass, but nobody else did.
Wow.
And it was a fairly stiff test.
Now, I'm assuming you more than passed it. You probably aced it.
Probably, but I was never told that I was not given a score.
Okay. Is that what gets you into the Navy?
That's what got me into the Navy, because when I was drafted, most of the people in the draft at that time in 45 were going to the Army. A few were pulled out and selected for the Marine Corps. A few were pulled out and selected for the Navy.
How old were you, though?
1945, 18.
But you hadn't graduated high school yet?
No, and I got my notice from the draft board, greetings, report for your draft. So I had to go. And I had this letter. I went back to the Navy and I said, look, I've passed the SETI test. Here's a letter. I'm being drafted. I want to go in the Navy. What do I do about it? I said, is there anything you can do to help? He said, oh, yes, there is. We can give you a letter of directed assignment, which says, to the draft board, we request that you assign this person to the Navy and because he passed this test for the electronic schools and so forth. They looked at it and said, no problem. So I went in the Navy. I went to the electronic schools.
So how many years were you actually in the Navy?
A little over 1 year. See, I went in June of 1945, and of course the war ended in August of 45. And
well, they didn't need you anymore.
They didn't need me anymore. Then was the big quandary on the part of the Navy. What do you do with these kids, all these guys that we got lined up for electronic schools? The war's over. There was a lot of pressure went on the Navy, from what I understand, from the Congress and the Senate. Now, who put the pressure on, I don't know, but that the Navy had taken these people in for these electronic schools. you will finish up their schooling. They will be allowed to complete their schooling, and will be encouraged to re-enlist, of course. When they were drafted, you theoretically could be dumped right out, but you would be encouraged to enlist for a fixed period of time in the Navy. The minimum period at that time was 2 years. Now it's 6. You can't do less than 6 typically.
You know what's coming to mind right now, and we're going to stay with your storyline, but here we are, 1945, and at that time, there's Ed Cameron and Al Bielek.
That's right.
They're both coexisting at the same time.
And both in the Navy.
And both in the Navy. And what happens if the two of you ever met each other? Because you weren't too far apart, really.
No, we weren't. Now, that's one of the interesting problems and one of the interesting conundrums and one of the serious problems, actually, of anybody involved in a parallel existence like that in the same reality. Or if they travel in time and one comes back, as I did, what happens, if you meet each other? Well, there's a lot of theory on this, but what I remember of the theory and what I have been able to put together, and this is partly conjecture and partly the theory, if you meet yourself at a given point of time, and there was a difference here, of course, there was an older Cameron body, which of course was made younger, so I don't know if the whole thing would apply, but theory says that if you meet yourself, one or both of you may snuff out of existence. Mm-hmm. And there's also a phasing problem in here which enters into it in certain eras and certain time phases, and I think this has to do with the biorhythms of the Earth. It is quite possible nothing will happen. Nothing will happen if you don't touch physically anyway. You can literally stand there this close and talk with each other. It might not be a good thing to do.
But if you touch each other,
that's where you would have the problem, because then you are closing physically a loop through time. Mm-hmm. If you're standing there talking with each other, you're not physically closing that loop. It's when you make physical contact is where the problem can erupt.
And this really leads to another question in my mind, and that is, if they wanted you gone, why go through all that trouble and all that risk of regressing you back and finding a new family? Why not just take you out?
There was a very good reason for that. And this gets back to what I learned later on in the recovery of my memories and the Montauk Project and what turned up in the Montauk Project. There was a very good reason why they had to keep me alive. There was a very good reason why they had to keep Duncan alive. It was the fact that we had gone through time. We were part of the time loop problem involving the Eldridge. We'd gone up to 83. Then we came back on the Eldridge to 43. Duncan jumped overboard before the, shall we say, the mist dropped and the ship was fully physically reinstalled in that era of 1943 on the 12th of August. He jumped overboard and went back to the future. But he was still part of the loop problem, meaning we'd gone from 43 to 83 back to 43, and as I remained physically. But one of the men who was involved with the theory of this whole business and set up the experiment in the first place was a Dr. Norman Levinson from MIT. You can find his books around on the shelves if you know where to look. He wrote a series of 5 books on mathematics that are in the open literature, and there was one that was highly classified involving time matrices and time equations as were used with this experiment. And one of the things he uncovered, and Preston was the one who finally found out about it, was that if you produce a rupture, or in this case it was not a true rupture, but a severe disturbance in the time field, and time is in a field form, it's tenuous, but it is an actual energy field. If you produce a disturbance in it, which disturbs the normal flow of time, you have, like in a improperly terminated transmission line for transmitting RF energy, you have a reflected wave problem. You can go back to the source. If it's damped, proper impedance on both ends, no such wave. But if you disrupt the time field, as was done with the whole problem with the Eldridge, you can create a backward wave. You can have problems, but you also, that was taken care of at another time in 1963, but you also have a problem that either end, there's a taper-off period, and so the past doesn't really matter, but the forward point from 83 to 2003 will take another 20 years before it's fully stable again of itself and remain self-stable. And this requires damping. For reasons I still don't understand, it was concluded that Duncan and I and Dr. von Neumann, for reasons of his own, at least the three of us, were involved in that damping process and had to be kept alive till the year 2003, no matter what. So guess what? Von Neumann's still alive. Duncan, of course, is alive, but in another body. But since it's from the same father, he's continued the genetic line.
So you say no matter what, you have to be kept alive at least till 2003.
Right.
But what if, say, today we get through with this interview, you walk outside, you drive in your car, and you accidentally wreck and die? What would happen to the time fields? And why don't they do something to prevent you from even being able to risk the possibility of death?
Well, in a sense, the question you're asking is answered. In another sense, it's not. I have been, shall we say, by various means, kept out of harm's way from major accidents through my life. I've had one or two minor car accidents which were meaningless. I was on a airline that's now defunct, which flew out of Atlanta.
Eastern.
Hmm?
Eastern?
No, newer than that. One of the smaller feeder ones. That
ValueJet?
Yes.
ValueJet.
Lost the plane in the swamp in Florida.
That was ValueJet.
I had been on that plane at least twice before that accident. Nefarious flights. I remember each time we got on the plane it had a problem. One time they had to stop and fix something. The second time they had to stay in the tarmac almost an hour while they changed an oil filter. And there was no problem after that. And I thought about this. At least the guys are fixing the problems. But there was that time, of course, when that came down in there, which, of course, wasn't a problem which was artificially induced. It was not a natural problem.
Are you saying you're protected?
Yes. By what or by whom, sometimes I don't know. There are other times when car accidents should have happened in front of me, and they didn't. I've seen this more than once. There was an even stranger one. Of course, everybody's heard about Flight 800.
Oh, yeah.
I was flying out of New York that night, that afternoon, actually, on TWA, out of LaGuardia, from a plane from there back to down here in Atlanta. And I got on the plane. I literally scan the planes when I get on because of the number of things I've seen happen. Is this plane safe? Is this going to have any problems? No, this plane's all right. I got on the plane. I sat down and started getting this uneasy feeling. I said, something's wrong. Something's going on. I don't know what it is. And I looked around, didn't see anything unusual, and the plane was running a little late. I happened to look out the window to my right, and over in another bay, there was a lineup of several 747s. And I looked over there, and I said, one of those 747s, or a 747, is going to be a problem. That night, TWA 800 came down.
So you were actually at the airport?
Yes, I was at the same airport.
Wow.
At the same airline.
And you just had a strange feeling?
Yeah.
Very odd. You know, that really opens up a whole new area to this conversation, which unfortunately we don't have a lot of information on. All we can do is try to piece it together for ourselves.
Yeah, that's true.
Mm-hmm.
But the other aspect is that, I am kept out of trouble. So has Duncan been kept out of trouble. Excuse me, von Neumann has been kept out of a lot of trouble. He's kept alive by various means. He's almost 100 now. And the last time I saw him 2 years ago, he was not in good shape. But he has something working for him because when his physical condition deteriorates enough, he takes a trip over to Europe for a month or two in the summer and comes back like a renewed man. I've seen it happen.
When's the last time you saw Dr. Van Neumann?
About 2 years ago.
Oh.
Two and a half.
How did he look?
Old, gray, almost no hair left. Quite literally down on the mouth, but he's been through one hell of a mill. And, of course, in the last few years, they've instituted on him an altered ego, an altered personality, if you will, so complete. The first time I went to see him, when I finally found out who he was and where he was, after about an hour and a half of conversation, 2 hours of conversation, where he's spieling out to me all of his exploits as a surplus property dealer in New York, dealing with all of the companies in Cortlandt Street and all the other places. Every name he put up was right because I had been there. And the companies, all of this. Went on through this whole spiel as Howard Decker. There is a history of a Howard Decker as an electronics surplus purchaser and buyer and seller.
But you're saying that's an implanted memory then?
It is an implanted memory, but there also was a real Howard Decker. But this man I was talking with was not Howard Decker, but he had that memory. Very complete. Finally I stopped and says, Howard, do you remember the Philadelphia experiment? Never heard of it. Howard, do you remember me? Yes, but I don't know where from. Eventually, when he made trips to Long Island, because he had a car and was able to drive then, this was in the earlier phases when I first met him, he would drive to Long Island. As soon as he got out of that area, there was some kind of an electronic field set up there to keep him locked into the altered ego, the altered personality. He'd drive to Long Island, he'd suddenly remember who he was, go look up Preston Nichols, whom he knew very well from the Montauk Project, and he'd get on the phone sometimes trying to find me. In fact, that was one of the strangest aspects, which I will tell later, about how I learned about von Neumann and how that memory of him came back and what happened when it came back.
Well, I tell you what, though, just to keep in line with our story of the story of Al Bielek, I sort of vectored you off of the part where you were just got back from the war.
Right.
So let's bring it back to there and then go forward.
All right. I just came back from the war. In my Navy uniform, my rank, I might add, was slightly lesser than it had been previously. It was aviation electronics mate specialist, 3rd class, because I went into aviation electronics, went through the Ward Island Technical School for the aviation electronics, their radar and all of that stuff. And then,
what did you actually do while you were serving in the Navy?
I didn't do a damn thing except go to school.
It's a pretty good deal.
It was a good deal.
Wow.
And it came the end of the schooling on Ward Island. We had a big spiel one day, a big public meeting of all of the students there, where there's various people saying all of those wonderful things about the future, and this is the last era of mortals and all of this and so on. And then, of course, the pitch was from somebody else, why don't you join up for the Navy for another year? You can take a 1-year hitch, you can take a 2-year hitch, you don't have to go the full 6 and all of this. They were desperate to keep people in the Navy at that time. I thought about it and I finally said, no, when I get out, I want to get out clean. It was not required then that you were automatically a member of the reserves. See, after I think about 49, they made it mandatory. You are a reservist when you leave active service. That goes on for the rest of your life practically until at least 20 years are up. I avoided that. Friends of mine who went through a year after me wound up in the reserves. But I got out and stayed out. And
did you go back to that trade school?
No,
that high school,
I didn't.
What did you do after that?
Eventually I went back and I started my own business. And partly out of despair and partly out of other factors. And it didn't go well at all, running a radio TV service business and then trying to do some sales. The whole thing collapsed. So I went to college in New Jersey, Newark College of Engineering in Newark, New Jersey, and met a very interesting prof there who now, in retrospect, I look at him, he looked a great deal like von Neumann. He was, I think, he was born in this country, but he had origins and family history out of Europe. Very, very nice guy. He encouraged me to continue on with my schooling and so forth, and he recognized the fact that I had abilities beyond the usual, I'll put it that way. But I wasn't at a point yet where I was exploiting them at all. So I went to school in Newark, went for a couple of sessions, then I decided that I would join a company as a field engineer. My business had failed. I needed an income. And I tried one or two things I didn't like. I wound up working for Curtiss-Wright Corporation out of New Jersey, running a flight simulator school. We trained in operating the flight simulators. They were building flight simulators for the Air Force and the Navy also, but they were building something more advanced than the Link trainer, which maybe you've never heard of, but it was an old mechanical type of pilot trainer, which Curtiss-Wright and certain people within the organization who formed the company thought of doing it by purely electronic means and doing a much better job of simulation than the old Link trainer, which they did, and the Air Force loved it, and so did everybody else, including commercial pilots who flew on it. They started building large simulators. The last one I saw before I left the company was a simulator for the B-52, and it was a monster, because in those days everything was still tubes. It wasn't solid state, and they had these analog motored servo-driven cords with wire brushes in them, which all figured in a complete servo loop system where signals are fed in from the actual controls on the aircraft, or the section of the real aircraft.
Did you help build this equipment?
No, I only serviced it. And instructed in its use.
Okay.
But it was very interesting equipment, a very complex monsters. They can build them much smaller now, but it got me out and around the country in the field, and then finally I decided, got this bug, I got to go to California. So I dropped everything, quit, and moved to California in 1954. And arrived in Hollywood. No, I didn't arrive in Hollywood. I arrived in Pasadena, California. Stayed in Hawaii for a while, looked around, finally moved into a boarding house in Hollywood. And looked for work as a technician, and I wound up working for North American Aviation. I had an offer from Hughes Aircraft in their instrumentation department, repairing all of their internal instrumentation, meters and whatnot, electronic test equipment. In retrospect, I would have probably done much better if I had gone with them, because not only the company, but I would have learned a trade which is good to this day. But I didn't. So I went back to school, and eventually I wound up getting out of the technician business and wound up being an engineer, and that was in 1958. I remained as an engineer, consulting engineer, traveling all over the country from 1958 to 88. And during that period I met an awful lot of interesting people and a lot of interesting engineers. The really interesting engineers that had things to talk about and to say were those who were consultants, because they also were all over the country, had talked with a lot of people in various companies, and it was then that I started to get interested in UFOs and the cover-up and the conspiracies that were going on and what's going on certain areas and behind the scenes, and I started to get some of the weirdest inputs from people who had actually been involved in some of these things, or directly on the periphery, or knew the secret projects of certain companies and what they were doing behind the closed doors, so to speak. I began to get an aspect of the cover-up that was going on, not only in the UFO field, but in a lot of other areas, which eventually put me in good stead, and I met some interesting people eventually from the military who apprised me of certain projects. Now, my interests were, of course, not only just UFOs at that time. I had an enormous interest in sci-fi ever since I was a kid. And of course, there were a lot of good sci-fi books, magazines, and such were written. I read them all. And then it expanded into the metaphysical area. And then I read this famous book put out by these two, I think Bulgarian, no, they were Russian writers. Secrets Behind the Iron Curtain, I think was the title, dealing with the psionic and psychic research and development sponsored by the Soviet government. Real hardcore stuff. And I read that book, and I was really fascinated by it. I says, here's the Soviet government doing things like this. Why isn't our government doing this sort of thing? Then I ran into an engineer at one of our projects that happened to be at ITT Corporation in Corinth, Mississippi. Well, I was down there for almost a year. And I brought this subject up to him because he was ex-Air Force. And he alluded to the fact he'd been involved in quite a few projects that he didn't really want to talk about. And he knew a lot of other generals, and he says, you know how things are decided in the Air Force? He says, no. He says, everybody goes out and plays a round or two of golf, and that's where the things get decided. And I said, that's very interesting. And I told him about this book. He looked at me, And after I said, why isn't the U.S. doing this sort of thing? He says, you don't think we are? I says, I've never seen any evidence of it. He says, what I'm about to tell you, you never heard. And you will never trace it to me or repeat my name in connection with it. Okay. He says, in 1940, there was a problem. And that problem was resolving around the fact that the intelligence community couldn't trace certain things that were going on, and the normal means of intelligence at that time was quite incapable of handling it. And Harry Bennett was the principal advisor to President Roosevelt at that time. And of course, much more can be added after I finish the story, but this is what I learned at that time. I said, somebody finally suggested to Harry Bennett, he says, oh, you can't find out through the normal channels. Why don't you hire a bunch of psychics? Maybe they can find out what's going on. Harry Bennett liked the idea. He was open-minded. He went to Roosevelt. Roosevelt was open-minded. He liked the idea. And he says, oh, gee, go ahead, Harry, try it. This is what I was told by this ex-military man. He said they hired a bunch of psychics to try and do a certain kind of espionage and viewing. I didn't use the term remote viewing then, but that was what they were doing. And to see if they could find out what was going on that they couldn't find out otherwise, and it seemed to be successful. So he said they formed a complete organization, moved it into an abandoned warehouse in Virginia, which was marked outside the property U.S. government, number 1, and number 2, abandoned building, dangerous, don't enter, and so forth. And they housed this group, which was called the Psych Corps, and exists to this day, in this group. And it was started in 1940. And he says, I can tell you, that's a real organization, and they know what they're doing. And it's a 5 years hand-on training program. He said, when they get done with them, he says, they know what they're doing. And he said, we have done just as much as the Russians, if not more. And he says, there's a little war going on between us and the Russians about spying psychically. This out of the mouth of an ex-Air Force man. And I thought, literally, I was dumbfounded.
Huh. Do you recall what that thing was that was going on that Roosevelt wanted to know about?
Yes, I know now what it was.
What was it? There
was a group of aliens who had contacted Roosevelt, and he had had contact with as a result of a meeting with Nikola Tesla in 1933-34, at the time when Tesla was named director of the Philadelphia experiment. And as I understand the story, what transpired was that Tesla had been making contact on a very regular basis with extraterrestrials off-planet through his equipment, which literally he had designed and built. He was working for RCA, and he was building the receivers there, and he had connections elsewhere with, I believe, Westinghouse transmitters, and he may have even designed those, because he was prolific in the stuff that he designed and built. And he had his own equipment, and he was talking to somebody every day that nobody could understand, and the man who told me the story about his equipment was Ralph Bergstresser, one of the, perhaps the principal technician working for Tesla during that whole period. But what happened was that Tesla, in his conversations with Roosevelt at the time when he was made the director of the Philadelphia experiment, of course wasn't called that then, he was discussing what he was doing, because Roosevelt asked him. He says, oh, I'm doing this and this sort of work, and they said, oh yeah, I've been communicating with some people who are from off-planet. Oh, what is this all about? And I told him, I said, well, it sounds interesting. Do you think possibly I could talk with any of these people? He says, oh, I'm sure it could be arranged. Come down to my lab sometime and we'll see what we can do.
Are you talking about Roosevelt now?
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, yes.
He went to Tesla's lab?
Yes. And apparently was able to hear these conversations and, in a manner, talk with them. How this was arranged.
Oh, through some electromechanical means that Tesla had built.
He talked directly into the microphone, but now who understood who, that I don't know. Mm-hmm. But he was convinced it was real. And he asked Tesla, he says, is it possible I could meet these people? And he says, that could probably be arranged. Tesla didn't commit himself outright, but he asked Roosevelt, well, why are you so interested? And he says, well, the United States is in one terrible depression. I said, I'm looking for a way to get out of it. He says, if these guys can help, he says, if they're from off-planet, they probably have technology which we don't have, and it might help us. So Tesla thought it was a good idea. and made whatever arrangements were to be made. And it was arranged that Roosevelt would take one of his famous trips to sea, and on one of the ships, probably an aircraft carrier, would meet these people, which he did. Now, he talked, apparently, from what I understand, with 2 or 3 groups. And he did meet, apparently, face-to-face, 2 different groups. One was the Palladians, and the other was this secondary group called the Kondrashkin, which we later nicknamed the K group.
Was this on an aircraft carrier?
I believe it was on an aircraft carrier. I don't know the details for sure, but I would assume that because they could bring a ship down and land it on the deck of a carrier out in the middle of the sea and nobody'd know anything, because in those days, no radar, no satellites, and not all that great radio communications. So in the dead of night, nobody's going to see anything except who's on that ship. And, of course, those personnel would be sworn to secrecy. So Roosevelt got a pitch from a Palladian group, and he got a pitch from the K group. For reasons of his own, he liked what the K group offered better, so he says, I will accept your offer of help, and so forth. So they came in and apparently, allegedly, worked with the group for some period of time through the White House, whoever he appointed. And in 1938, they came up with a proposal for building a whole new industry in the United States, which they said would definitely get you out of the Depression. And what was that industry? Atomic industry, atomic energy, before we had any. So in 1939, speaking historically, that was when the first splitting of the atom was officially announced, the splitting of uranium by the Fermis, I believe, in Italy. But this was in 1938.
See, that's interesting, because I always thought our first contact was with the aliens in Roswell.
No.
But you're saying we had it way before then.
Way before. The earliest first contact goes back to 1908.
Wow.
That's another story.
Yeah.
But
and what I'm trying to figure out, though, is you said that the reason for Roosevelt to use remote viewing was...
Well, I haven't gotten to that point yet.
Okay, you're
the issue, I have to give you the rest of the story, and then you'll see what the issue was.
Okay.
The reason, well, first of all, Roosevelt was all in favor of it, the military was in favor of it, and so forth. And they offered this industry, and Roosevelt approved of the idea. Then he went to the military advisors, as he goes to all of his advisors. The military advisors consider it, and they say to Roosevelt, thumbs down. Why? He says, look, we don't know that they're going to give us everything they know. They may hold something back on us. And he said, with something like this where we still don't know what it may all involve, he said they could put themselves in a position of being able to control us.
Who is the K group again? That's
Kondrashkin. I don't even know where they're from.
Is it the Draco people?
No, it's not Draco. We're separate.
Kondrashkin.
Kondrashkin, yeah. That's the name I was given.
Okay.
Duncan remembers the name for some reason also.
Mm-hmm.
But so Roosevelt ultimately turned them down. And he says, well, they said to Roosevelt, says, if you don't want our proposition, that's okay. He said, there's nothing else we can do, and they disappeared into the woodwork. I mean, they just vanished. Well, the intelligence community at that point was very concerned about a bunch of aliens running around on Earth in the United States, or wherever they may be. How do we find them? Are they still here, or did they leave? They pose a potential threat. Well, Roosevelt agreed, and none of the intelligence people who tried to find out where they had gone could find out anything, whatever. I mean, they literally disappeared off the face of the Earth. Maybe they did actually take off. I don't know the answer to that. But it's because of that literally the suggestion when it was made to Harry Bennett about using psychics, that's when they latched on the idea of using psychics for espionage and for remote viewing. And, of course, that program took very well as a result of this K group problem where they couldn't find them. And whether they ever found them after that or not, I don't know. But the thing was established quite well that you can use psychics properly trained for espionage for, as they originally viewed it at that time and proved it, they could start a fire in a filing cabinet 3,000 miles away and burn up somebody's records. And they were trying to entice them into doing more overt actions than that, like namely psychically killing at a distance. And what I understand, the Psych Corps says, we won't do that. You already got your own people to do that. We won't do it. We want to have no part in that.
Oh, well, if you listen to any of the remote viewers on the radio today, they'll say that there's no way you can psychically influence, I believe that's what they call it, another.
Oh, boy, tell me another one, huh?
Really? Well, I mean, do you have first-hand experience?
Of course you can. There was another program, I say a government program, I mean, many years later, back in the period around 1966 to 69, in which a movie was made. The movie was let's see, Operation Dreamscape. Dreamscape was the name of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
It mimicked and told the story of a real project called Operation Dreamscan. Dreamscan was a continuation, you might say, in the way of research in terms of what you could do psychically, in terms of a more physical effect. The theory of that movie, and of course of the actual operation, was that if you could psychically project yourself, I'm speaking astrally or however, into another person's dreams during their normal dream state and kill them in the dream, they'd die physically. And there would be no trace of how they died.
It'd be just like a heart attack at night.
Exactly. That program existed for 3 years, and one of the principal targets of that program was President Jimmy Carter.
A target?
Yes, because they were trying to force him through the dream operations, not to kill him. That wasn't the purpose. The idea was to force him, or let us say coerce him, into signing a test ban treaty and a missile ban treaty with Russia at that time. He was close to it, then he suddenly backed out. As I remember historically, he suddenly turned us around and refused to have any further part of it. And it was at that time that the operation was uncovered. And as I understand it, certain people advised the president of what was going on, and he looked into it and found out, and he shut the whole operation down, bang, like that, had it disbanded, and it has never been resumed. But that was an extension of what you can do psychically to somebody. Yes, you can have some very powerful effects on people if you know how to manipulate, let's say, their innermost workings or innermost soul, whatever you want to call it. There are ways of affecting their energetic bodies.
This is an interesting take on why this group was disbanded. This is the, the psychics that did remote viewing. Is that who you're talking about?
Yeah, that group was never disbanded. They kept right on going, but they...
The remote viewing group. Well, all the people that get interviewed on the radio say it's been disbanded, and that's what they all say, and that it was disbanded because I guess the people in Congress would have a hard time explaining. Politically, it wasn't the right thing to do, so they just disbanded it.
Politically, it wasn't the right thing to do. Well, let us say, in terms of today's parlance, it might have not have been politically correct to admit to such an operation. But believe me, it is still ongoing.
That's what I can't believe that if there's something that effective, they would just let it go.
And there are many other levels now of, let us say, psychic operations ongoing, which have nothing to do other than the fact that they use similar techniques with the original Psych Corps. This original Psych Corps still exists, but you also have had set up Army remote viewers with Army training schools. Skip Atwater was the chief instructor, and he's now head of the Monroe Institute, technical director. He's not the head of the Institute.
Are you saying there's more than just the Army remote viewers?
Oh, yeah.
Several others?
Oh, yeah. The CIA's denied that it ever worked. They've got their own group.
Right.
NSA has their own little group, and there's probably groups we never heard of.
I'm sure. Let's get back, because we sort of took another left turn here.
All right.
We're back in California. I think you said you're there till '88, working with the California North American Aviation Company.
Oh, that wasn't in '88. No. North American Aviation was back when I originally went there in '54.
Okay, '54. So now let's go. We're in California. What is the next significant thing that happens to you after 54?
Next significant thing was...
Well, I know you talked to this military man, and he started...
That was much later.
Okay.
But at that time...
But prior to that, had you been involved in anything strange? Or are we getting to that? Okay, let's...
Not directly. In 1955, I had changed jobs. I decided I liked the idea of going back to being a field engineer, and there was an offer in the works and an advertisement. I went down and talked with the company, and I was hired on the spot to be a field engineer for Hoffman Electronics, which had Navy contracts for some of the equipment they were building. Plus, you go to their school and learn the equipment, and you go out and be a field rep for them, install equipment, maintain it, and write reports on its performance or lack of performance, and so on. And I wound up assigned to Pearl Harbor, the Navy Yard in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. I was there over a year. And so I go over there, and eventually I got a beachside apartment. And in and out of the Navy Yard, the first thing I noticed when I went in there was that this thing had a feeling. I didn't say look like. I had a feeling of being familiar, that I belonged here. Well, of course, little did I know that I had been there in 1941 when we left the USS Pennsylvania, when I went and dive dock and went to San Francisco. But that feeling sort of persisted throughout my entire stay there in the Navy, as a civilian working for the Navy Department. Eventually, the job ended, but before it did, one other very significant thing almost occurred. About June of 1956, the office staff there was invited to a Saturday afternoon party by two of the naval officers connected with the office in their apartment, which was out in Kaneohe someplace, which is well east of Honolulu, out in the boonies, if you will. And we were having a great time there at the party. Everybody was getting sloshed, which is so typical of the Navy and typical of parties on the island. What else did you do then? Everybody drank like a fish, even the civilian bars, including me. And I was drinking and feeling no pain, and I was looking at these two officers in fatigues at the end of the runway. It was almost like a runway. It was a second-floor apartment, and there was the extreme end of the walkway and the door to their apartment. And I was looking at them, and I said, there's something here that's familiar. I'm not quite sure what it is. It started leaking through. I fit in the position of one of those officers. Now, who fits in the position of the other one? I said, somebody else fits, I know that. But it never quite broke through who it was. And it would have been my brother, but at that point I didn't know I had a brother, no connection with this other thing. And possibly one more drink would have broken it through, but at that point I said, I better not drink anymore because I got to drive all the way back to Waikiki Beach, and I'll be in no shape to drive.
So that was the first time you had any inkling about this past life?
That's right. That was the first time I had any real inkling.
Okay.
And yes, it would have fitted because we were both the same age, and at a certain point we probably bore quite a resemblance to those two. And we, of course, in our own time did our own bit of drinking too, like it was very standard in the Navy. Very few in the Navy don't. But that was the beginning of the start of a breakthrough. I've never forgotten that point, and I realized, I might have been able to force it at that time, but suppose I had. I wouldn't have been any other data to support it. I wouldn't have been able to put it in its proper perspective.
Yeah, it would have just seemed like a dream.
That's right. It would have.
Which is going to be, what most people are going to ask, I would imagine. How do you know? How do you know it really happened? Because you're really counting on your memories.
I'm counting on my memories, yes, but also there are other people. When I get into the business of uncovering...
Yeah, we're going to get into that, sure.
What happened to me in the process of going around the country lecturing on the subject.
Mm-hmm.
The people that came forward and said, we knew you, or I knew you back when. I knew you on the Pennsylvania. I knew you here. I knew you there.
If
all
you were,
part of the Philadelphia Experiment sequel.
If you're trying to take an inventory of all the people that have come up to you and said, Al, I knew you as Ed,
mm-hmm.
Just a rough guess, how many people would you say?
I would say at this point there was at least 5, it might have been 6. But I know right now directly I remember 3. So it's between 3 and 6.
People who came up to you and verified, they said, I knew you
when.
when.
Yes, exactly.
Well, now you have Preston, you have your brother.
Yeah.
Others.
Yes, there were others. So that, in the period of time, helped. There was one man.
Was there anything else, though, besides just people coming up to you that sort of helped convince you that it was real rather than just something in your own mind?
Well, as time went on, one of the things that occurred when in New Jersey before I moved to California, I left out, in 1951, because of my interest in expanding into various areas of ancient history and strange phenomena and such, there was somebody I knew in New Jersey that said, "There's a man in New York you ought to go meet." And I said, "Who's that?" And I said, "There's a guy by the name of Ivan Sanderson. He's on Gary Moore's TV show. He's written a number of books, and we think he's British, but you really should go and visit with him and see him." He said, "He may be of some interest to you and he might be of some help to you." So, okay, I called him up, got his phone number, went over there, visited with him and his wife in his little apartment in New York and 45th Street off Broadway, and went out that night to one of his favorite restaurants, which he used to do radio talk shows even from that restaurant. And
was he a radio talk show host?
Not a host as such. Most of the time somebody else hosted the program. But in the earliest phases, he carried on almost as a host. He was a one-man show.
Mm-hmm.
And he would speak in English, he knew some French, and it was very interesting. He had a huge library. At that time, he was only living in New York. Now, when I moved in 1953, I moved to California, I lost contact with him. In 1963, one of my jobs, I was in State College, Pennsylvania, and I said, I better call my old friend Ivan, because this is not far away. So I finally got him in New York, and he remembered me. He says, "Where the places have you been for 10 years?" And I said, "Oh, Los Angeles and all over the place." "Oh, I'd like to get together again." "Fine, and where are you?" And I said, "I'm State College, PA." "Well, I may have business out that way. I'll let you know." And it turned out he couldn't make the trip. He says, "Why don't you come visit me down on my farm?" I says, "Farm?" I said, "Aren't you in New York?" I said, "Yes, I'm still in New York, but I got a farm in New Jersey. I've got an animal farm here, and a retreat and all of this." So I visited him. It was very near Hope, New Jersey, out in the boonies. You got to have a map to find this place. But he had a natural preserve, and he had his wife and his friends and everyone there, and he had established an organization in the meantime, sort of an organization, loose-knit, of people interested in similar phenomena of natural occurrences, UFOs, strange phenomena of every conceivable type, ancient phenomena, ancient history.
So he was sort of the ringleader for all that in New York, right?
He was the ringleader in New York at that time. That is correct. And he maintained his talk shows. He maintained his apartment in New York till the day he died, because he says, "I'm not giving up the New York apartment." He says, "I'm under rent control there. For $245 a month, I got an apartment in New York that's furnished with maid service, front door service and everything else." He says, "It would cost me that to rent a room in a hotel for a weekend."
So what did Ivan do to help confirm to you?
He was interested in the Philadelphia experiment.
Oh, he brought that up?
Oh, he brought it up. And
so
sort of fanned my interest.
I see, okay.
And
how did he actually know about it?
I'm not sure how he learned about it exactly, other than he said in the meetings, his background, I might add, was British intelligence. He was in MI4 or maybe not MI5, but he was rather high up in British intelligence. He had his own sloop. He and his girlfriend, long since his wife, used to travel around in the Bahamas and down through that whole area on assignments for British intelligence. And 6 months before the war ended, he was ordered to return to England on one of the bombers that were being ferried over to England on a very regular basis at that time. And he says, "There ain't no way I'm going back on one of those things." He says, "Half of them are shot down even today." And so he literally jumped ship and stayed in New York till the war was over, went in hiding, came out. Everybody had a good laugh, and he stayed in New York and got on the radio talk show business with Gary Moore and then others, and then, of course, established his own reputation with a series of books, natural history and unnatural history, if you will, things which he wrote well, and the books went well. And he established his group there, and he was the head guru of the whole area.
Right, so he brought the subject of the Philadelphia experiment up to you.
Yes, and the reason he brought that up was that he maintained his status in British intelligence, and he remained a British citizen. He applied for American citizenship, and he was told by the State Department, no, you keep your British citizenship. It says you'll be much more valuable to us as a British citizen than as an American citizen because you have connections over there which we don't have. So we maintained that. And he went in, as he was in naval intelligence with the English, he then became very friendly with the naval intelligence in the U.S., and he used to make a lot of visits to the Pentagon. And he told me about some of them. He says, you wouldn't believe what they discuss here in the Pentagon in a closed circuit, so to speak, in the closed environment of inside the Pentagon, all about UFOs, the latest sightings, all of these things, recovered bodies, and so on. He says, it was hard to believe that these people then would go on the outside and lie and say nothing was going on. He says, when you hear them on the inside, it's another matter.
Well, he's a talk show guy, though. How is he even allowed to go inside the Pentagon?
Because of the fact that he had the proper clearance by the State Department and from the Navy.
But how did he get that clearance if he was on the air talking about this
He could still hold the clearance and talk on the air, but he didn't talk about those things on the air.
Okay, other things.
He didn't talk about the classified stuff on the air. He knew it better than that. He started to write private files, and he had a lot of private files on this material which were not open to the public. If you joined his organization, which was founded around about 1965, the Ivan T. Sanderson Foundation, which later was changed to the name of SEATOOTH, Society for the Investigation of the Unexplained. I was a founding member, but at one of the original meetings and so forth. But anyone who joined the membership list actually became a going member, got a quarterly bulletin, I think it was, Pursuit, and also had free access to his files on site. You couldn't take anything out. Stuff did disappear, of course, but basically you couldn't take anything out. Eventually, the Library of Congress got interested. This was at a later phase of his life. They were involved in UFO research, and they heard that he had enormous files on it. He had 16 filing cabinets full of stuff, not all UFO material. And he had done some investigations of his own, one of them being the Flatlands Monster, as they called it, in Virginia. And they came to him, Library of Congress. That's the kind of reputation he had. So he knew a lot about a lot of things. And he tried to investigate the Philadelphia experiment, and he was told by the Navy, yes, there was an Eldridge. Such a ship did exist. No, we don't know any records of a Philadelphia experiment. We don't know what you're talking about. He says, that rumor's been around. He says, no, nothing like that ever occurred. That was the official line.
So it's odd, though, that he brought that up.
Yes, he did.
With you,
that's right,
given the wide scope of things that he was actually investigating.
That's true.
So there could be something behind the scenes working this.
Very possible.
Mm-hmm. We'll never know.
No, at this point we won't, because he died of cancer 13 months to the day after his wife died of cancer.
Okay, now, by him bringing up the Philadelphia experiment, did that spark something in you? Did that spark a memory?
Not directly, not immediately. Mm-hmm. No, it did not spark any memories. But it sparked an increased interest.
So that got you going in that area?
Yeah.
Okay.
It got me going in it. And there was quite a little bit being published about that time, because it was in 1955. There was an article published in one of the magazines on the alleged Philadelphia experiment and Einstein's connection with it, and the emergence on the in-basket of Admiral Firth about the annotated notes of one of the astronomers on the case for the UFO was the title of the book, Mark Jessup. Morris K. Jessup was the real name. Mm-hmm. And that got widely circulated and started a whole flurry, which literally opened up the subject on the Philadelphia experiment wide open, and it was the door and the lid could never be closed again after that. Mm-hmm. Even though the military tried to and the Navy tried to deny all along. But on a popular level, the lid was off. And it stayed off. Morris Jessup had a fairly good reputation, and in the process of his investigation, what fanned it even further was when he got involved on the investigating committee, which was headed by Vero, had a Navy officer in it, a man by the name of George Hoover, who I did talk with. He's in not good health now, but I talked with him about his connection with it, that investigation, and what he found. He was quite open with me on the phone.
Were these private investigators, or were these investigators within our government? these people?
These were private investigators, but it did have Navy people involved because the Vero Corporation at that time was commissioned to write a duplicate of this book, the annotated case for the UFO, and reproduce it and distribute it, in which they put in all of the footnotes and all of the main text of the original book and so forth. And then these people in the group committee, if you will, made their own comments, which are, I think, appended in the back part of the book. Now, nobody at that point proved that it had been a Philadelphia experiment, but the issue was raised by one of the writers. That was a man who called himself Carlos Miguel Allende. His real name was Carl Allen. That there was a Philadelphia experiment. He was a witness to it and what happened and all of the horrors connected with it. And, of course, that sparked Morris K. Jessup's interest. He spent 4 years of research, finally decided he thought the answer to what was really going on. And on that particular day, he called a friend of his up in Dade County, Florida. He says, I'm coming over for lunch and I'm bringing my notes. The public story is that he never arrived for lunch and that he was found dead in his car the next day of carbon monoxide poisoning, i.e. a suicide, the hose through the window and that sort of routine. Find out privately from other sources many years later that isn't exactly the way it happened. Yes, he died all right of monoxide poisoning, but he was the victim. He wasn't a suicide. But he made it to his friend's place for lunch with the notes, and they discussed the whole thing. A phone call came in during that period of time, and warning Jessup that his life was in danger over the matters he was investigating. He should be very careful. And allegedly he left rather hurriedly in his own car and left the notes behind with his friend. Stopped in the park in Dade County, and this informant, because I was on a radio program in Seattle, Washington, and this guy called in on the talk show and said, I want to talk with Al off the air. He insisted it had to be off the air after the program was over.
Did you talk to him?
Yeah, this is what he told me.
Okay.
He said he told me about this aspect, and he says he went to the county park, Dade County Park, parked there, and he says, I drove past in the afternoon. He said, I didn't know whose car it was or who was in the car at that time, but I happened to notice the license plate number or something strange about it, and there were two very tall, thin people around the car, and whoever was in the car seemed to be passed out. He says, I noted it as something strange, and I had a feeling I better not stop. And he says the next morning, of course, was the story in the press about Morris K. Jessup committing suicide. And he said, I looked at the car and the photos of the car, and there was the same car and the same license number. He says, whatever happened to the other two I saw, I don't know. But he says, I got the strange impression that they figured that I didn't really see anything, so they didn't do anything about it. And he said, this is what I saw, and I'm telling you. And he told me this on the phone. He says, Jessup was not a suicide. Now, nobody figured properly in their right mind he was, because he was hot on the trail of this investigation. He had problems with his wife at the time and was separated from her. But he was known by his daughter, I believe it was, to be in very good spirits because he was continuing his investigations. He was not in the kind of mood that would lead to suicide.
Right.
So he was silenced. And, of course, that hit the press all over the country and what he was investigating. Well, a little more heat on the fire.
Sure. That's probably why they don't take out UFO investigators nowadays, because it certainly leads to a conspiracy notion.
It would lead much more heavily.
Gives them credibility.
More credibility to the conspiracy theorists
Absolutely.
who are rampant today, and they have every good reason to be. And, of course, every attempt to calm down the fires and fan the flames into with some cooling material doesn't work very well.
No. Now, as I understand, all of this really got you interested in the paranormal, the UFO, the Philadelphia experiment, but you went back to California eventually, I assume. When was the first time that you ever got involved in something which you and I would consider strange, like Montauk and those things?
While I was in Hawaii. The first incident I told you about.
Right.
The next incident was very strange. It was after that office party, perhaps a month or two. was late one night. It was a very hot, sultry night, late June, early July.
Okay, we're still in Hawaii right now?
Still in Hawaii. This was 56.
Mm-hmm.
I was sitting out on the seawall of the newly renovated and reopened Royal Hawaiian Hotel, and I got very languid and very sleepy, and I passed out sitting on the seawall. And I woke up sometime later. As I looked at the watch, it was about an hour and a half later, with a feeling of being drugged. And where the blazes was I all this time? What's been going on, and so forth? And finally realized I was in the same spot, and it was the same evening. And as I say, I looked at the watch and found out the time that had passed was something over an hour. I couldn't figure out why I passed out on the seawall and what had happened. I was still sitting in the same position. But I knew, as I was in or quite sensitive, I knew something very unusual had happened. I had no clue as to what it was at that time. And I sort of let it sit in my memory. Eventually I left, of course, the island, went back to Los Angeles, and I was there until 1960. And 1960 I moved to Phoenix, because my parents had long since moved to Phoenix. And speaking of the Bieleks, of course.
Well, the question is, why were you groggy?
Yes. Wasn't anything I drank, because I wasn't drinking that night.
Uh-huh.
But my parents moved to Phoenix in 1960, and they bought 1957 and 1960, they bought a house in Scottsdale. And 2 months after the house was bought, my father went in the hospital and died. So I moved up to Scottsdale to sort of take care of my mother and keep eyes out for her, and continued doing my traveling and consulting work out of that house. I moved out from LA to there. But in that period, I still didn't really have a clue as to what happened in 1956 on that seawall. I knew something had happened that was very unusual, but not a clue. Another strange thing happened while I was in the island twice, and this all fits into the later aspect of the Montauk project, but at this point I had no idea what the fitting together of the pieces might wind up being. I used to do a lot of barring, and one night I went up to a bar on the east end of Kalakaua Avenue, where a very well-known Hawaiian performer, female artist, piano player by the name of Momi Jones, was playing in sometimes a downstairs bar and sometimes the upstairs bar. Well, that night she was in the upstairs bar, and I went in the upstairs bar and was there listening to her, and then some guy wandered by me to look like a Marine out of uniform, and I made some comment or other, and we finally got talking about various things and subjects, and got into a sort of metaphysical discussion. We closed the bar, went downstairs, and we talked till dawn next to his car. It was a small MG, the typical type of MG at that time. Well, where do you work? Who do you work for? Can't tell you. Well, what are you doing? He said, what's it in? And finally he says, well, I'm working in electronics. And I said, yeah, who for? Can't tell you, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we parted company, and I was thinking, well, I'm never going to see this guy again. I didn't know who he was, where he was from, or anything else. 1 week later, or maybe it was 2 weeks later, same Saturday night, same place, upstairs in the same bar, he shows up again. I said, look, let's get the hell out of here and go talk someplace. He was drunker than a skunk that night. It was his turn, so to speak. I wasn't drunk that night, but I had a drink or two. And he said, something there in the men's room. He disappeared. Never saw him again. He did turn up again, all right, at the Montauk Project. But to tell that story, you have to tell a lot in between, which will probably be in the next session. But that was the other strange clues that were dropped on my lap, so to speak, at that time when I was in Hawaii.
So it was not an accidental meeting you had with this gentleman, was it?
No, it was not. He actually was seeking me out. I didn't know that until many years later. He was a bird dog.
Now, let's go back to that original question I had. Why were you groggy that night?
Why was I groggy that night? That was because, actually, at that point, I assumed that something unusual and metaphysical had happened. And I'm not entirely sure of the sequence of which happened first, that groggy thing on the Sea Island or meeting this guy in the bar. It was all around that same period of time. Sequentially, I would have had to met him first because of what happened. That groggy feeling was a result of having been yanked through time and actually being indoctrinated in and becoming part of the Montauk Project for quite a long period of time, and then brought back. They typically, if they pull you out of a location, they bring you back to the same point where you came from at the same time you came from,
sort of like
within a very short period of time. It could be a second, it could be a half hour. Their technology at that time wasn't that precise that they could do it within a minute or a second. Now they can do it within a split second.
Okay, wow, that's amazing. I think that this is a great place to end this part of the talk today. When we get into the next part, it's starting with Montauk, it looks like, and we'll go all the way through that till the present.
Yeah.
So we've been talking this time with Al Bielek. It's been a wonderful talk, and look forward to the next one.
Okay. Good deal. I'll give you your mic.
Okay, we're interviewing Al Bielek again. This time we're going to take it from the point when you left the Navy for the second time.
Yes. They, of course, before I left, twisted my arm to join the reserves and all of that, but I decided I wanted out without any hooks into me. Most of my friends signed up for the reserves, and some of them regretted it because they got pulled for the Korean War. But I didn't, because I hadn't signed up. So in 1947, after looking around at the job market, which was not terribly proficient at the time, and of course I did not have a college degree at the time, I decided to go into my own business, doing radio, TV repairs, audio work, designing and building audio equipment, and that sort of thing. That lasted until about 1951. In 52, and I saw it was getting nowhere, so I decided to drop it. Actually opened a store in Nutley, New Jersey. Seemed to go fairly well for a while, but it decided to peter out. Couldn't pay the rent or anything anymore. I said, this is enough, and go to work for an honest living and make a salary of some kind. So that I did. I wound up, after one of the false start, I answered an ad and decided I would look into a job offering by Curtis Wright Corporation in New Jersey, Caldwell, and a number of other locations. Bloomfield was where the one I answered was located, as an instructor and representative for them on their flight simulators in the flight simulator school. Well, that intrigued me because it was for the Air Force as well as the Navy, and involved flight trainers as well as flight simulators. I became involved with the simulator program. Very large, complex pieces of equipment involving anywhere from 8 to 30 cabinets full of electronics. Especially designed analog card, or actually a stack of them, 6 or 8 of them on the end of a servo system, which simulated the various aspects of the electrical signals on board the aircraft that they were simulating. They actually designed it to simulate a specific aircraft. And as such, we had to be trained to that specific aircraft and the specific simulator and know how to fly it ourselves and, of course, how to repair it. Because these were sold to the Air Force.
Was that your job, Al, was to repair the simulator equipment?
To teach class to the Air Force personnel in the flight simulator, to make sure every morning it was working properly, do a test flight, as it were, and then sit back and hope it kept working for the rest of the day without any hitches. Most of the time it did, sometimes it didn't, and that's where we came in. We had to actually repair them and put them back into service. We were contracted out to the Air Force at various locations. I wound up at Seward Air Force Base in Nashville, Tennessee, and I had not the slightest idea what Nashville was like until I got there. Talk about a hillbilly town in the middle of the 50s. It had some very famous operations going. Grand Ole Opry was in full swing at that time in the old Opry House, the original one. I went to two of those sessions. You wouldn't believe these people up in the back rows of the Grand Ole Opry. Minnie Pearl and the whole 9 yards of them out on stage. I mean, they put on a show like you wouldn't believe. And these hillbillies, pardon the expression, coming up from the hills and coming up in the upper tiers of the balconies, they filled the house nearly every night that they performed. And they carried on, I think, was a show in itself, quite aside from Minnie Pearl and her group. Of course, they would go out after the show was over, and they would go to the local bars, and one of the other guys with me, a man by the name of Godbout, who was from New Jersey, they used to go with him, Minnie Pearl and the group, and drinking. He was quite a drinker. I was rather moderate at the time. And go out with these people at all hours of the night, as they partied to all hours of the night. Then they go down to Ernest Tubbs' record store, which was quite an institution in itself, and stand outside and carry on. He'd play records, and they would have a party out in the street. Nashville in those days, I'm sure, was not at all like it is now. It was a rather wide-open town, and almost anything went on. So I was there until I was brought back, and they were going to send me to Germany. And I decided, in retrospect, I think it was a mistake, but I decided at the time I didn't want to go to Germany. I wanted to move to California. So I severed my relations with the company, moved to California. Cold turkey. Enough money in the bank to finance my trip, making quite a tour out of it. I had a brand new 53 Lincoln. And this was in 1953, 54. And wound up there, moved to a boarding house, and finally got to work with one of the companies in the Los Angeles area, North American Aviation, as a technician. Over a period of time, I did more schooling and finally wound up getting myself on staff as an engineer with a company up in Northern California, Ampex. That blew up in my face about 3 months later. I liked the company, liked the job, and liked the area, but somebody in the company didn't like me. And I got called into the office one day and summarily fired for, quote, incompetence, unquote. When I heard that, I said, "Are you crazy?" I said, "Well, that's what I have here." Now, this was the personnel director. He only did what he was told. It wasn't his fault, obviously. But I went back with friends in the company. They blew up, and it went all the way to A.M. Ponyatov himself, founder and president of the company. He blew up. He started an investigation to find out what was going on, and my record was wiped clean of the charges that were made, and there were some reprimands, I'm sure, but I was out. They didn't want me back, and I found out I was blacklisted up and down the entire peninsula. Silicon Valley was not, at that time, a fully blown Silicon Valley. It was in its earlier days, like Hewlett-Packard had only been in operation for a few years.
You were blacklisted just because of that Ampex
That's
situation?
Correct. I found out later I was not the only one where this happened to. There were others who were kicked out the same way.
What were the charges brought against you?
The charges were that I was incompetent, technically, which was absolute BS. Name was erased, but I went back to Los Angeles, went to work down there, went back to school, and eventually wound up as an engineer with another company. I wound up in the consulting field, if you will, working for a company which I know is now out of existence, what was typically in those days called a job shop. They started in the mid-50s, and they expanded to a nationwide operation with hundreds of them in the business, literally putting on the staff and hiring for a specific job an electronic engineer who had the background and experience, and they would be parceled out to a company who was short of engineers, couldn't get them in the front door in the normal manner, so they go to these consulting firms, properly, I think, and very commonly called job shops, and say, "We need X number of people for certain categories. Can you supply them?" And they say, "Sure we can." And they would send the bodies over, like myself or somebody else, to be interviewed by the company as a client company. And usually as a perfunctory interview, they go mostly on their resume. And you were in there on your own. If you performed, they kept you. If you didn't perform, you're out the door in a couple of weeks. But I was always liked, and I always performed, and I was kept on most of these. And eventually one of them wound up with the Space Technology Laboratories. They wanted to hire me permanently, which, again, in retrospect, probably should have stayed with them because it was a very prestigious company, and they were into all of the space stuff, everything. And
what was the name of that company?
Space Technology Laboratories. They later merged with Aerospace Corporation, or Corporation A, as it was sometimes called, which was strictly under the control of and hired out to the Air Force, and did some very highly classified work. As I know now, they were involved in a lot of the, not only the space studies, but things involving the space program, extraterrestrials, and God knows what else, and highly exotic communications equipment. That was their bag. Aerospace built very exotic communications equipment. I helped design some of the stuff for STL, which is why they wanted to keep me on board. And at that time, what we were doing in the earliest days of solid state was quite exotic. Of course, in the 50s, we've gone far beyond that state now. But what we were doing then was considered quite exotic. And if you could do something with a solid state, you were in demand. So I went with the company. I wound up being all over the country. Small company in State College, PA, called Secor Corporation. Worked for them for a year. When finally they ran out of work for me to do, they wanted to hire me permanently too, and I didn't want to stay in State College. It was a small town. College town, yes, but had lousy winter weather. And there wasn't really much to do there. You had to drive to Pittsburgh or someplace else if you wanted to find some social life on the weekend, unless you were in the university and the inner circuits of the sororities and fraternities, which I, of course, was not. As I finished that job, I got an invite by the chief engineer of another company working in State College who was, in a sense, competitor to Secor, except that their work was all military and government. Secor was primarily commercial, but I did work on a few government projects, making highly exotic solid-state pulse amplifiers operating out to 1 gigahertz. This was in 1953. And he called me over and says, I would like to talk with you, see if you might be interested in working for us. So sure, I'll come over and talk with you. So I did, and he gave me the cook's tour of the company, this production line. They were doing ECM gear, electronic countermeasures gear, and he showed me the receivers in the production line. Remember, this is 1953. They had receivers in production going out to 2.5 gigahertz, all solid state. And I said, there's no way. And he says, well, we're getting some rather exotic devices from the companies. I found out the story about that later. But he said, we have certain techniques we use on these devices. We can get them to operate at 2.5 and 3 gigahertz. And of course, this is all proprietary stuff, and you're not to talk about it. I said, okay, of course, this is, what, in the 50s? So it's 45 years ago. They're going far beyond that stage now. I mean, now they build countermeasures receivers that go out to 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 gigahertz, and commercial. But what I saw then, he wanted me to come to work for the company, and I says, thanks very much, I'd like to work for your company, but not State College. He smiled, and he says, I can't say I blame you. I left. I kept doing this for many years, traveling around the country, and I took 6 months off in 1961 to take a tour to Europe, sort of a 6 months off type of thing, and went over there to Europe for 6 months, stayed in Germany with a friend, toured Europe, Italy, had a cousin in Italy then, outside of Rome, went down there to see him and his mother, came back eventually and went back to work. This went on through various phases until, I might add, I spent several years in Salt Lake City working for Unisys. What is now Unisys System is in Univac, and various other places where I worked repeatedly. I had repeat returns to some of these companies where they wanted me back repeatedly. So I guess I did what was right by them, otherwise they wouldn't have asked me back. In 1988, I was in Scottsdale, and I got an invite to work for a small company supplying telephone equipment in Scottsdale. And it was fairly small. They had a main office in another company, another location, I might add, and they were on a wholly owned subsidiary. And this company was building special and rather exotic telephone systems and telephone test systems for phones. And I got involved with that. This lasted until June. Now, this was 1988. In January of 1988, it was a famous Saturday night when I watched the movie for the first time of the Philadelphia Experiment on HBO. And that brought back to me the fact that I had been part of the Philadelphia Experiment. It didn't bring everything back all at once, but I realized watching that thing that I was involved in it.
Well, before we get into that, Al, between 61 and 88, that's almost like 30 years, almost.
Yeah.
What was your primary activities during that time?
Electronic engineer working for various companies on a contract basis. I did work for one company in Phoenix, Arizona for a while on a permanent status. That lasted about 2 months, and the president of the company and chief engineer was running a turnstile and bring people in to stay a couple of months and kick them out the door, and I was one of those that got kicked out of the door.
So you were a contractor for...
Almost the whole 30 years.
So did you have your own company as a contractor, or
No.
did you work for a company
No,
that
I kept working
contracted
for
you?
these job shops.
Wow, so you... In 30 years, there's a lot of different projects you worked on.
Oh, yes, many, many.
My God.
My resume reads rather long, about 5 pages, if you want all of the details.
No, it's okay, well, let's move up to 88 then.
In 88, that famous Saturday night, it's about 4 in the morning. I was about to retire, and it announced on HBO the next movie of the night, a feature movie of the night, will be The Philadelphia Experiment. And I says, oh, I got to stay up and see this, but I've heard so much about it, and I've never seen it. So I did, and of course, with the commercials and everything, it lasted till 7 a.m. I was a little groggy by that point. But the first 15 minutes of that presentation was so close to reality as to what actually happened that it jogged my memory rather harshly that I had been involved in it. It didn't fall into place exactly all at once as to which one of the two principals of the movie there were. There was a guy played by, not Ambrose, but
Michael Perry.
Michael Perry.
Right.
And he was a good-looking one, and actually he played the part of what would have been my brother. And they had a role model. My brother was around, and consequently they found somebody that looked like him. But the other guy, they assumed was a friend. Of course, it was his brother, me, and they had no role model. The two of us had a degree of resemblance, a family resemblance. But they picked this short runt with wore glasses, who was the other guy as part of the team, who had the pregnant girlfriend. Well, the pregnant girlfriend was mine. And that's a long story, but in whatever case, that as part of the original scenario, the Philadelphia Experiment, actually did happen. But in any case, in the movie, they showed the two, of course, jumping overboard, winding up in 1984, which was an error, whether accidental or deliberate, I don't know, in the underground out of the air base in Utah. There was an air base involved, but it was not in Utah. It happened to be Montauk Air Force Station in Long Island in 1983. A person did some research on this, and he claimed that the original crew doing the filming went to Montauk and wanted to actually film at Montauk Point, the other half of what happened. And they were the Navy, Air Force, all of them refused to have them there. They wouldn't allow them to. That's when they went to Utah. Appropriated this old air base, which was abandoned. The old buildings were there, and the people in the town who wanted to move on the base and build a new city hall, so to speak, they says, you want to use this for a movie and burn it to the ground? He says, have at it, be our guest, because we want to get rid of the buildings anyway, and after this is all over, build a whole new city hall complex. So that's what happened.
So what was it like? You were sitting there watching the movie, and then all of a sudden you say memories came back.
Yeah.
Were they vivid memories or vague memories, or how did you know that there were memories of an event that really happened for you?
That, in a way, is hard to answer. The sequences which actually brought it back started first with a night out in the bar the night before, which took place downtown Philadelphia. And there was an actual bar there. It was called the Blue Lagoon. And it did exist up until about 1993. Friends check on that, and they says, yeah, it was the same one. A friend of mine who was part of the experiment remembered it, and he says it disappeared in 93.
Okay, that's a sequence in the movie itself.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was an actual bar involved. They didn't name it in the movie. But everybody's down there, the final night out. They stuck a few things in for interest of the movie, which did not happen. And, of course, we all got on the base early that morning, really, in order to board the ship. Now, the ship was all ready. Of course, I had been in that bar, but not the night before, because we were in the final preparations. The rest of the crew was there the night before. But we had to make our final preparations, adjustments, and make sure the equipment was functioning properly, and they arrived. The movie showed about 150 personnel boarding the ship, which was a normal complement for a destroyer escort in peacetime. There was not 150 on board that ship for the test. It was about 30 to 35, including the officers. And it was a skeleton crew because we'd already taken the ship out to sea for a shakedown, and we knew the ship was seaworthy. They wanted to be sure it was because they intended to literally ship it out immediately and start outfitting other ships because they had already built up something like 10 sets of spare equipment, so all ready to go. And the crew goes on board, and in the movie they say it was in October. They showed them wearing pea jackets, which meant it was a cool day. It was not. It was in summer. It was in August. It was a hot day. It gets quite hot in Philly in the summer. And we went downriver about 6 miles, and the test was conducted there. Now, in the movie, they don't show exactly where the test was conducted, but they did not show it being conducted in the Navy Yard. It was not. And that part was correct. But they show it going downriver and, of course, turning on the equipment. And then the ship, of course, disappearing completely. And then on board, they did show, quite correctly, that Duncan and I running the equipment. They showed the two guys running the equipment, which was Duncan and myself in the movie. They didn't show them as Duncan and my brother, but as the two guys actually who were set up to run the equipment. In the movie, they showed them as enlisted. Actually, as a matter of fact, we were both officers. They wanted the two guys running the equipment who were fully versed in the equipment, knew the theory, knew what it was supposed to do, and if something went wrong, maybe could figure out what to do to make it work right. Well, that was our problem. It started to go haywire on the second test. First test, everything worked fine, except for the side effects on the personnel. The second test, on 12 August, everything went wrong within a short period of time. In terms of what we saw and what we experienced on board the ship, after about 30 seconds, we saw strange things like the vacuum tubes glowing unevenly, getting brighter and dimmer, which you don't do unless you up the filament voltage enormously, like from the normal 6.3 to about 8.5, 9, which would do it, or drop it to 3 volts, would make it dim. It appeared that something like that was happening. We had no idea what was going on. But then we got a whole series of phenomena like high voltage arc overs, except there was no high voltage equipment in the room. In retrospect, I looked at that as something starting to develop from another domain because I didn't know, Duncan didn't know at that point, that the ship was already out of the harbor in hyperspace. And what we were experiencing was the side effects of going into hyperspace. We were getting what appeared to be high voltage arc overs in the control room, and it wasn't high voltage. It was etheric energy arc overs of some type, which we could not explain then and could not explain now for that matter. But it kept getting worse, and we couldn't shut the equipment off. All of the control, every control was locked. We couldn't budge them.
Okay, now we covered all of that in the Philadelphia experiment. I'd like to go back, however, to that original question which I had about your memories. How were you able to discern, or what was the process of these memories coming back? Are you going to get to that? Okay, the first thing which jogged memory was that last night out in the bar. Even though I was not in there the last night, it was a familiar scene, the dancing and everything else. Boarding the ship was not of itself especially memory jogging, but seeing the ship at dockside was. Going in the control room definitely was memory jogging, and showing the failure of the equipment or whatever was going on, something was going wrong, and we ran out of the room. That definitely brought memories back, because that's exactly what happened. And then when we jumped overboard, that was exactly what happened. But of course, like in reality, as in the movie, we never hit the water. That was real, and that was a jogging of the memory. Hitting the underground, which actually in the sequence of the movie didn't happen immediately. It was long after this chase and the whole scenario I won't go through for the movie. But eventually getting to the underground and seeing the old man, Dr. von Neumann, that also was memory jogging. But at that point, I realized it started to overwhelm me, and I started to feel I've been involved in this before. I've seen this before. And it started to surface. It didn't all surface at once. It actually came back over the next 48 to 72 hours. The next day, I remembered something which von Neumann had told me. I remembered I had a family. B, I had a son, which I had no memory up to that point, to the point of seeing the movie that night. And I was not in the movie either. C, von Neumann told me that if I ever remembered my involvement in the Philadelphia experiment, he would try to call me within 72 hours. It was 48 hours after that. It was one of my last days on the job.
It was not the last day. Actually, it was in February, late January, early February. He tried to call me. So I don't remember the exact weekend in January when I saw the movie. But it was several days after that he tried to call me from Preston's office in Long Island, because he was quite mobile at the time. Would get in his car, drive out of the area where he's living, which was upstate New York, come down to the island for various reasons to see Preston. And at that time, when he goes back down there, he used to remember who he really was. And he wanted to call me. He didn't know where to reach me. Preston knew where I was. Preston called me, or attempted to, and the secretary at that time did not take a message that somebody's trying to call me all day, several times. And she did not take a message. Didn't let me know if somebody's trying to call me. I was in the lab all day, and finally I saw her late that afternoon. She said, "Oh, somebody's been trying to call you all day." I says, "Well, who was it?" "Oh, I don't know." And gave me the phone number. I believe she did at that time. I called Preston that night. I says, "You were trying to get me all day." And he says, "Yes." I says, "Where were you?" I says, "I was in the lab." I says, "Didn't you get a message?" "No. No message was given me till I left." He says, "Well, von Neumann was here. He was trying to call you." And he says, "Oh, my God." So I knew at that point that he was involved, and he realized that my memory, don't ask me how he knew, but my memory had come back, unless it was the fact that he, like other people who time travel, suddenly became very psychic. And that might have been the reason why he remembered. I can only guess at that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. So right. Do you think von Neumann actually did a lot of time traveling himself?
Yes, he did. He did quite a bit. It was part of another phase of the, shall we say, the interim between the two experiments, that is, between Philadelphia and Montauk. When the two locked up, this is something which I haven't mentioned before, when the two locked up, they created a problem. The problem was an enormous disturbance in the time field. Now, the time field normally flows at an even rate, and like at a RF transmission line, which is driven at its characteristic, at its characteristic impedance and terminated at its characteristic impedance, energy flows through that transmission line evenly without any reflection. If you change the terminal impedance to be unmatched, you get a reflection, a reflected wave that goes back to the source. You get standing waves as a result of this, and this, of course, is inefficient transmission. Eventually you get to the point where there's very poor transmission or none. The time field is very similar. If you produce a disturbance in the time field, or let's say the caliber and the size which was produced by the lockup of the Philadelphia experiment with the Montauk, you are disturbing, you might say, the characteristic impedance of the transmission of the time field, and it produces standing waves. And it did. And von Neumann knew this was happening, and he knew the next node point after 1943, which produced enough disturbance of its own at that point. And it was 1963, and he got together with some other scientists and realized if they didn't do something to damp this out in 63, they were going to have a very serious problem, like most of the North American continent was going to disappear. There would be the rest would be, except for the mountain chains, would be underwater, ocean water. He knew this. He got a number of scientists together. I talked with one of the others who is from our time. The other two, number 3 and number 4, are from the future. I never found out who they were. And they engineered some equipment which was installed at Montauk in about May of 1963 to put Earth on a different timeline. Earth is not on the original timeline. And this is known in certain quarters. And there is efforts being made, or let us say promulgated, theorized that we should get Earth back on its original timeline. Not until after 2003, if at all.
So is there an Earth out there that's actually on our original timeline? That's
debatable, whether there's another Earth on the original timeline. This depends on how heavily you accept the idea of parallel realities and how real are parallel realities. I do know that equipment was built, and they did shift Earth off the original timeline, and what they did was provide an artificial damping through that period of August of 1963, so there was little or no disturbance. And I remember that one other engineer who, without his permission, I won't give his name, he is known in the profession today, and he does get around a bit, and I have not seen him in the last year or two. But he said even there was traveling up and down the whole time period between roughly 1958, 59, and almost the year 2000, in fact beyond 2000, to collect the scientists, including this guy who was pulled out of 1975. And even President, one of the presidents was involved in this and knowledgeably, and says, I don't want my office underwater. You have my authority to use whatever means are necessary, and whatever funding you need will all get to you.
Well, that'd be Kennedy at the time.
No, it wasn't Kennedy. This, of course,
Eisenhower?
It happened in 1975.
Oh, 75.
Yeah, that would have been...
Ford, I believe.
It was after Ford's time.
Well, Jimmy Carter came after that.
It was Ford, it was Carter, then...
Reagan after that.
Reagan was the man. Reagan was, let's see, he would have been 84 to 92.
Right.
It was in that period, so it was later than 75. He was involved in some way in this project. That's at least was told me by this scientist I will not name, who was very good in math himself. But they did divert the problem, and we're now waiting for the final phases of the damping, which will be in 2003. But that was one of the little side issues that occurred, and I lectured on it once, but only once, and didn't go into it again. I didn't think it was appropriate, and I don't think the people, for the most part, would have any understanding of what I was talking about. The one group I did lecture to did somewhat appreciate it because they were into some very exotic things because of the group, United States Psychotronics Association. Mm-hmm. Anyway, that was one of the little interim things.
Well, let me ask you this way. Where is the time field generated from?
Based on what I know from then as well as now, it is basically generated from the galaxy center. It encompasses our galaxy. Every galaxy, in essence, has its own time field. Mm-hmm. Consequently, they don't all run at the same time rate.
So there's not one in the universe, the center of the universe?
At the center of our galaxy.
Right.
For our galaxy, there is a time field encompassing our galaxy.
How about for the universe? Would there be a time field?
I can't answer that with certainty, but I don't think so.
Okay, but you're sure about the galaxy, right?
Yeah. And if you upset the time field, it could upset the entire galaxy.
And is that what Tesla was able to tap into?
Yes. He was able to tap into our time field
to synchronize all the equipment?
To synchronize our equipment for the FAA by generating a connecting link, if you will, by certain specific hardware, which nobody really understands how it works, but obviously Tesla did. He designed it, which locks itself into the zero time point, which is the center of the galaxy. A zero time reference is the center of our galaxy.
Is this a mechanical thing that's emitting it?
It's a mechanical, electromechanical. It's not even electronic. It's electromechanical, believe it or not.
Have you ever seen it?
Oh, yeah. A lot of those pieces of equipment were built for the FAA. A lot of them were built in miniature for certain very exotic pieces of communications equipment.
No, I mean at the center of our galaxy. What physically is there that's emitting this time field?
That one I couldn't even begin to give you an answer of.
Have you ever seen it?
Seen what?
That whatever it is in the center of our galaxy.
No.
Or is it just theory to you?
There's no piece of equipment per se sitting in the center of the galaxy. It is a phenomena which is tied to the fact that you have celestial mechanics which dictate the motion of all of the solar systems. Our solar system, of course, operates within its own sphere of influence based on the sun, but our sun is locked to the galaxy, and to the center of the galaxy, moves around the center of the galaxy in its own orbit, taking all the planets with it. But they're all locked in their own manner to the center of the galaxy. They all are operating off that same reference. Don't ask me how it all works. That's celestial mechanics far beyond my comprehension.
Mine too.
But it was not beyond Tesla's comprehension because he designed and built this equipment. And it has been built in as part of the reference, the time reference for certain very exotic pieces of communications equipment. I've seen some of them.
Is that the equipment that was both on the Eldridge as well as at Montauk?
At Montauk, exactly.
Tesla built all that equipment?
Tesla did not build any of the equipment at Montauk, but certain of his concepts were involved at Montauk, including the zero-time reference generator. The scuttlebutt has it, to use a Navy term, that the same exact physical piece of equipment was used on the Eldridge as was used in Montauk. And if that is a fact, of course you got essentially a 40-year time discrepancy. If that was a fact, then you would have an explanation, I think, that would top all the others as to why the two projects locked up. If they use the same physical reference of hard piece of hardware, then of course they would lock up if you were in a very critical time, such as 12 August.
Well, that would make sense if that was true, but do you have any knowledge?
I do not myself. Preston
Okay.
insisted that it was the case.
Okay. Okay, well, let's go back to your memories, though.
Okay.
You were watching the movie, time passed by, you started saying, I know I have a family, I know I was there.
Right.
But was this a sort of a feeling like, well, maybe I was there? Were you 100% sure at that time, or was it just starting to come back?
It was just starting to come back at the time I was watching the movie.
Yeah.
More came back that night, more came back the next morning.
Well, what did you think about those memories, though?
At first, I wasn't sure. And I might add, at a certain point, after this started coming back and I started looking into it and started asking other people what they knew about it, and if anybody else remembered this, that I was involved, and yes, there were other people who remembered it, but it came a point where I began to wonder, is this for real? Did this really happen, or am I hallucinating and generating false memories?
I mean, were they very vivid memories?
They were. They became very vivid memories at a certain point. Not initially that vivid, but further on they did become very vivid, including what happened when I jumped off the side of the Eldridge with Duncan. Those memories finally did come back in a very vivid aspect, and I might add that the much more vivid memories came back after I had the work done on me by a certain person living then in Scottsdale, Arizona, who knew I had imbalanced left and right brain lobes and did his particular work to rebalance them. He says a lot of memory will come back after you get those rebalanced, and it sure did. Vividly, it came back, including exactly what happened after he jumped off the Eldridge.
Is this the same procedure that they use when people have been mind-controlled to deprogram them?
I can't say that for sure, because the deprogramming techniques used by the government may not bear any resemblance to what is done on the outside.
So this was just a doctor or a friend of yours?
He was a person doing a lot of treatment of people on a holistic basis. And I was introduced to him through friends, and he made a few tests, found out I had an imbalance problem, says he could correct it. It would take about 6 months for the way he was doing it. Didn't take that long, but I came back in 6 months, and he made a further examination, says you're okay now.
Did you notice your thinking was different?
Much.
Clearer?
Much clearer. He knew what he was doing.
Mm-hmm.
There are other techniques other than what he developed that will do the same thing, such as the alphabiotic system. That will do it a little quicker, like 15 minutes instead of 6 months. And that requires special manipulation of the head and the neck. Precisely what they do, I don't know. I did go through the treatment once to see if it worked, and it did. But I already was balanced. It just, shall we say, increased the intensity of the balance. A short test for this is whether or not you can see, and you've probably seen, in fact I did show them to you, these stereo images buried in a computer page, which looks like just a bunch of gobbledygook symbols on a piece of paper, which usually are shown in color. If you can see the buried stereo image, you're in balance, right and left brain lobes. If you can't see it, you're out of balance.
Well, the good news for the listeners is I was able to see it right.
Yes, you
right
saw
off
them
the
very
bat.
well, very quickly.
And the interesting thing is, though, I have talked to numerous people after you showed that to me, and only about 2% of the people I've talked to actually say that they can see those images. The other 98% of the people say, no, they cannot see them. They sit and they stare, and those images never come out.
I went through that myself once.
Yeah. Now, some people will say, if I really, really work at it, I'll see one eventually.
That may be, but it says that their synchronization is marginal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the time frame should be no more than about 15 seconds to see the image. And if you're really uptight, locked with your right and left brain lobes, you'll be able to see it in about 1 second, 1 to 2 seconds.
That's about what it took me.
Yeah, well, it says you're very well synchronized, and you never were desynchronized. Of course, you have an unusual background.
Indeed, I do.
And this is the problem. In the U.S., most people are desynchronized. And I don't know if this is accident or by design. I'm beginning to think it's by design, at least in the last 30, 40 years. Now, if you go back, and these images don't go back even 40 years. They were developed by a company in the early 90s. I've seen the concept in other forms with paintings people have done as early as 1990, where I couldn't see them. I remember one person looking at it and says, I can see them, and everybody else looked at them and says, I can't see them. This is a standard problem in the U.S., and I'm beginning to think it's by design and not by accident. Many things can cause the desynchronization. Extreme trauma, basically, will do it. It causes if you stress the brain far enough, it desynchronizes and will even shut down temporarily. And you will come back later to consciousness, wondering what happened, and you may be, from that point on, desynchronized. I'm saying this by conjecture because in each case it's different. You may not know.
We're not sure, really.
You may not be sure, right?
Right. It would be real interesting to have done a study to have those things, say, back in the 40s or the 30s, and to give those stereo images to people back then to see how long did it take for them to see it versus a group of people today.
That would be interesting if those had existed at that time.
That's right.
Or if you could go backwards in time with one of these books and test the people.
What would your hypothesis be?
My hypothesis on that would be you would find a great deal more synchronized brains back in the 30s. After the stress and the trauma of World War II, stress and the trauma on the civilian population, even though we never were subjected to any bombing, or that what went on in Europe, the trauma was still here in the sense that people had to work extra hours, long hours, and there was concern at that time, because I lived through it, of people wondering whether we would ever be hit, whether we were going to win the war or not. Not until about late 44 into early 45 did it appear certain we would win the war. Up until late 44, it was still not certain. And for that matter, in the eyes of the Allies, they weren't really sure either, because even at the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans came close to winning that one. They had a lot of reserves we didn't give them credit for. They had a vast amount of expertise, and they had secret weapons, which they made one mistake after the other. And as some of my research has shown, one of the Americans who went over to Germany to help them with their, I've forgotten the German name for the flying saucer, but the various types of flying saucer they had, an American who gained the trust of the Germans and actually it would appear was working against the Germans by giving them the wrong advice, delayed that program long enough that they were never able to bring enough of those into bearing on the war to shift shall we say, the balance of the war. There was a lot of bad decisions. Some of them were just plain bad decisions in terms of the German high command. Some of them were the worst decisions came out of Hitler after 1943. Yeah. And he quite literally lost the war for them hands down. They lost it militarily. But there's a lot of evidence now that they didn't really lose a war in the terms of the political sense.
Well, this is a little off subject here, but I've read somewhere that the Germans did have alien technology. Apparently there was a downed craft. I believe it was a Palladian craft that they got their hands on.
Yes,
do you have any direct knowledge of this, or is it just through your research that you found out about this?
The information I was given was that the Palladians, that is, deliberately crashed a vehicle in the Bavarian Mountains in late 1935 to give them the technology and also apparently enough gold to bail out the Reichsbank, because and this was, when I say the Palladians, this was a very specific group of them, the Aldebaran group.
Right, there's several.
Yeah, there's 5 basic.
Okay.
7 sisters planet, they call it. 7 star systems, all part of the Palladians. There's 7 planetary systems, and 4 or 5 of them are part of the Council. And the Aldebaran group is one of these, what should we call it, a splinter group. They're almost outlaws, not truly outlaws, but they do not heed follow any of the rulings of the General Council, and they do things on their own. And they were concerned because they had helped engineer some of the Aryan groups, and Hitler was saying that he was all for the Aryans, and they bought that, and they were concerned with this, and they were able to time travel, and they saw that Hitler was going to be losing the war. and they were concerned about preserving the Aryan stock. So they offered to help Hitler. Certain conditions went with it. And this is one of the interesting aspects of it, because I got wind of this and got the information. And literally the information came from the horse's mouth.
Which horse?
The Pleiadians.
Oh, that you got?
Yes.
Okay.
And they made an agreement. They tried to make an agreement with Roosevelt. Roosevelt wouldn't have it. And they said at that point they realized, because they would not, Roosevelt would not work with them, they realized there was going to be World War II. Because if Hitler had not come to the power point, which he did, because of the aid he got, and Roosevelt had accepted the help of the Pleiadians to get out of the Depression, which part of was concerned, their concern was that Roosevelt abjured war. In other words, will follow a peaceful course and not get involved in Europe. It could have avoided World War II. That was what the Pleiadians' basis of thinking was at that time, as I understand it. And I have to say, as I understand it.
Yeah, that's true, and I'm sure we're going to get into that as we talk about the Montauk Project. But what do you think the negative side for us would have been had we made those agreements?
That's a very good question. Certain things happened, and this is, of course, looking at the overall spectrum, which you can do now much better than you could, let's say, in 1940, or 35 even. Hitler was given help. His rise to power came in 1933, but his meteoric rise of the Wehrmacht, of the German war machine, was unbelievable between 1935 and 1939. He rearmed Germany and became the power of Europe, in fact, the power of the world.
Almost
in a 4 to
overnight.
5 years.
Yeah.
Overnight.
Unbelievable.
It was unbelievable. He had outside help, obviously. He had financial help in order to pay everybody. He also used the financial trick under Schacht, who was the head of the Reichsbank, of doing what we had done originally in the U.S. Constitution money was issued by the government and not by the banks. The banks will charge you interest, and eventually they'll bury you. But he did the same thing in Germany. He instituted constitutional money under the German Constitution by the banks being cut out of the picture in part. I don't think they cut them out totally.
Our Federal Reserve would not like that, by the way.
Well, we're not going to the Federal Reserve System. But he had the German government issue the money to pay for the war machine, to pay for the armaments he had ordered and so forth, and the whole thing went together very well. The German people were totally in back of Hitler. There were of course, a few dissidents. The dissidents eventually went to the camps. Now, one of the things which the Pleiadians extracted from him as an agreement for their help was, he says, we know you have a Jewish problem, but there will be no rough stuff. There will be no harsh handling of the Jewish situation. It will be handled discreetly, calmly, and with kid gloves. He agreed to this, and so did the man who was the head of the SS.
Is that Himmler?
Himmler. Himmler and Hitler both agreed to this, as well as the other top people. There was no hatred against the Jews in 1935, 36. They were inviting them to leave. And large numbers did leave Germany between 1933 and 1939, roughly 1 million, because the German population of Jewish people dropped from 1.55 million in 33 to 0.55 million in 1939, those records coming out of the World Almanacs for the various years. So the official records show that the Germans were encouraged to leave, and they did, and they took their money and their possessions with them up to 1939.
You mean the German Jews?
The German Jews.
Right.
After that, it changed. Now, in 1941...
What was the other part of the agreement, by the way?
The other part of the agreement was that they wanted to see the Aryan people survive, which is why they were giving them help. Of course, Hitler, in terms of the German people, was claiming most of the German people of Aryan stock, and he was to preserve them and to make them a whole nation again, and essentially a whole civilization.
But was Hitler even an Aryan himself?
No, he was not. Hitler was Jewish, believe it or not.
Yeah, I've come across that a time or two.
Oh, yes.
His mother, I believe, was Jewish.
His mother was Jewish, and his true father, his official name was Adolf Schicklgruber. That was his father's name. His true father was fully Jewish. I was a Rothschild. His mother, apparently, used to do little chores and so forth for the Rothschilds, as many people in Germany did at the time, with the wealthy families. You go there, you do house chores, and you're paid for it. And the Rothschilds were known to play around, and I guess his mother must have been in line with one of the Rothschilds, and the rest of the story was that, of course, Adolf was born out of that illegal wedlock, if you will.
Have you ever been able to corroborate that with anybody? Or is that just some research?
That's some of the research I've done. It is corroborated by some researchers, but I don't think there's any way of corroborating that on a hard, cold, factual basis.
There's not much about his parents.
Very little.
Sure, very, very little. Yeah, there's just the sort of the assumption out there that they may have been Jewish, but why this keen desire on his part to keep the Aryan race strong?
He did a great deal of research. I mean, speaking of Adolf, he did a great deal of research in his early days. He used to live in flop houses and other places while he was growing up. His mother kept care of him part of the time, and then he'd go out on his own. He did a lot of research during that period of time in the University of Library at Vienna. He never went to the university, as far as I know. But eventually, when his mother died, he came into inheritance, and he sort of cleaned up his act and dressed up properly and shaved off his beard. And then he became involved in some of the metaphysical research societies. And one of them ran him through a ritual, which was basically an opening to him of certain of the metaphysical aspects. He became, through peyote, a certified black master in 1913 or 1914 in one of the metaphysical societies. And he was accepted as being part of the black arts side of it at that time. Came World War I, he volunteered for the service, and he became a courier on the front line. This is verified history and verifiable. And he took the job, which had a typical life expectancy of 2 weeks. He lasted throughout the entire war as a courier.
How did he do that?
That's what a lot of people want to know. He was injured slightly once. That's the only time in his entire life he was ever injured. Every attempt on his life made in the later days when he was Adolf Hitler in Germany failed. He would leave before the bombs went off. Whatever else happened, the bombs refused to go off. They could never hit him.
You think that had something to do with his black magic?
He was accepted as a black master. He also had his connections with Tibet, with the Black Hat group in Tibet. He had connections there through not only himself, but through the SS organization. They had their own little, shall we say, black arts group or society. There was various connections which have been researched by various people. One of the researchers was a man that wrote one of the principal books on Hitler's life, The Spear of Destiny. I think it was Jim, I'm not sure, Jim or James Ravenscroft, who went through the whole metaphysical history of Hitler. He got all the information straight out of Hitler's mouth. When Hitler was before the war, basically.
Well, I thought before the war he was interested in art and actually applied
to an art institute. Yes, he was. He was an artist also.
And got rejected, and that's the reason why he turned out so bad.
Well, that's one of the theories. He did do a lot of paintings. He was not officially accepted. He tried to get him into Vienna and the art groups there, and they rejected him. I've seen some of the pictures of some of his artwork have survived. I don't know whether the actual artwork has survived or not, but many photos were made of his artwork. Actually, he wasn't a half-bad artist. I've seen much worse. I won't say I've seen much better, of course. But he was an artist of some note, and he liked to do his own paintings. This was in the early days before he got into the political movement. Now, how he got into the political movement, I think, is open to a lot of grabs in terms of what is the real history. Somehow he became involved with his own group, cronies and the brown shirts. Then they had, of course, the financial collapse of Germany in 1923, where they took a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread. That was deliberately engineered. Then they had Germany so weak they were going to try and get the communists to take over. He had no connection with the communists other than he was totally against the communist movement, and that was the political basis on which he started his career, saying Germany should be for Germany, would keep the communists out, and he promised us the German people, and they backed him because of this, and he did keep the communists out, because they were close to taking over power also in Germany around 1928-29.
Sounds like he was just a brilliant man who knew how to take advantage of everything that was in front of him.
He was a very
raise to the
brilliant
top.
man in terms
Until
of...
the end, of course, when he became
Well, he went
insane.
off the deep end at some point, but before that, he was a very brilliant man. He was an astute politician, if you will, in the sense of being aware of political history. And he saw, apparently, the history that should have been Germany's, not only from the standpoint of World War I and the way Germany was dealt very badly at the peace table, but also the fact that Germany and the German race, he got into the whole Wehrmacht thing, he got into the Wagner thing and Wagner's ideas, which were expressed in music. And he realized and believed that Germany should have a place in the sun and a place in the future, and then he became his battle cry.
Sure did. And do you think he knew he was Jewish?
Of course he knew what he was. But this is one of the aspects, you see, because of it, I believe, now I have to put this as my belief, because of his Jewish connections and what he knew of his connections with the Rothschilds and other Jewish groups, he took a great dislike to the way they were maneuvering the banks and so forth. And he saw them as a threat. He saw them as a threat to Germany. He saw them as a threat to the future of Germany. And one of the things he promised early on after he was fully in power, that is after the burning of the Reichstag, and he declared himself dictator. First he was the Reichschancellor, then he became dictator. And the German people bought it because he promised them everything, and he delivered on his promises in the first few years up till 1939.
Now, do you think any of that had to do because of his black magic background or
I think
contact with aliens?
I think it had a great deal to do with his black arts background, plus he became involved with the aliens. Now, how he became involved with the aliens is a great mystery in itself. I do not know how that came about, other than the fact that he was approached. Now, why he was approached by the Aldebaran group, but that I don't know, other than what I understand, that the Aldebarans were concerned about preserving the Aryan connection.
Okay, but you're saying that you did speak with a Pleiadian who gave you information about this relationship he had. Is that correct?
Yeah, I got information both indirectly and directly. And he was contacted, and they made the deal with him. They would help him. And apparently they were not expecting him to go to war. You see, one of the things that's been lost in the history of World War II and is mistaught or misunderstood in both cases apply was that Hitler declared war on England. No, he did not. He said he would never declare war on England. He made that as a point of honor. He said, they are Aryan people. I will never declare war on them. See, Winston Churchill declared war on Germany.
Well, what about Poland and all the rest
That was
of it?
because of the Polish incident, because there was a secret alliance between England and Poland. Now, the story goes historically that Hitler attacked Poland, but they neglect to state the fact that apparent, and I have to say apparent because this is what the history says when you dig, Polish regulars crossed out of Poland into the corridor area of Germany and attacked German soldiers and a German outpost or something like this. And this, if true, was an act of war against the German nation. Of course, it became known immediately to Hitler, and Hitler sent his regulars in after them to chase them out of this area, and he crossed over into Poland. Now, this was considered by Poland an act of war on the part of Germany. They contacted England, and Winston Churchill took this as an excuse to declare war on Germany, which he did. Now, Germany, in retrospect, had to declare war on England because they had war declared on them.
What about France and...
They sided, of course, with England.
That's
But
right.
the initial action was England declaring war on Germany because of the Polish incident, and then France immediately joined in with England. And then, of course, the thing was laid out from about 1 September, I think, was the attack by Hitler across the border into Poland.
Went quickly.
It went very quickly from
Very
that point
quickly.
on.
Yeah, he was well ready, though. I mean, if you just look at the way his nation was configured, it was configured for war.
He was
No
set
question
for war.
about it.
He was set for war. There was
Right.
no question about it.
Yeah, so he was expecting it. Okay, let's kind of get back a little bit. We one thing about this program is we take some interesting twists and turns.
Yes.
As one question leads to another question
Yeah.
to another. Is there anything you want to?
Well, there's one thing I want to add, yes.
Okay.
The Pleiadians pulled out of their backing in 1941, and they just withdrew. I've not been able to get a hardcore reason why, But it was also known that in 1941, medically, Hitler was in sorry shape. It was stated by his doctors and by historical reference that he developed a bad case of syphilis, possibly a terminal case of syphilis, and they didn't expect him to last much longer, but he did manage to last a lot longer. Quite a few years, in fact, until 1983. How he got the syphilis cured, nobody knows. But it was also noted by...
Wait, did you say till 1983?
93.
93.
93.
Okay.
He did not die in the bunkers after the war.
That almost went right past me now.
He did not die in the bunkers. This is well documented and is coming out of secret records that are now being released from the United States.
That he died in 1993.
That he did not die in the bunkers. They didn't say when he died in those records. Well, he had a double. It was his driver who looked a great deal like him, and it was someone in the family. It could pass easily for Hitler.
So where did he actually move to?
He went to South America first, Argentina. Then he went to Antarctica, where they had the bases already set up. And then eventually he went to the United States. He was in Portland, Oregon for a number of years. Then he moved after 1960 to Arizona, to one of the small communities up north of Phoenix, not Flagstaff, but Prescott. He was there until 1984.
As a guest of the United States government?
I'm not sure how it was arranged. I only know that he was there, and I know he was there because a friend of mine living upstate New York, who was one of his art dealer collectors during the war and after, had correspondence that went on with Hitler twice a year. And he says up until 1984, he kept sending letters to Adolf in Prescott, Arizona, and they were returned. And that is not the letters, but an answer was given back to him by Adolf. In 1984, the correspondence ended. Now, he assumed that Adolf died in 1984. He didn't know. But other records I know of, and people who were in the CIA have said flat out they saw him in La Paz, Bolivia in 1989.
So did he enjoy a comfortable life, you think?
Apparently he enjoyed a comfortable life thereafter. There are many aspects of this one can speculate on. Why was he allowed to leave?
Yeah.
And why was he allowed to go to the U.S.? Why was he never treated as a war criminal? One would have to speculate and say he obviously, in the eyes of someone, was not a war criminal, i.e. he did the job that he was set up to do. This, of course, was going to tread on an awful lot of people's toes, but you have to look it back from history, as it were, and get away from the close perspective and get a more distant perspective and find out who benefited from World War II.
I'd say the bankers.
Exactly. They set it up. They wanted it. We hadn't had a war since the World War I, so let's have another one. It turned out to be a bloody mess, but they made tons of money because they financed both sides, and they make money off of both sides. They don't care who wins or loses. They control it from behind the scenes.
But, from their perspective, it'd be a lot easier to kill him than risk the chance of having someone see him and identify him.
Well, they did identify him in Portland, Oregon in 1960. They had his picture published in the newspaper.
Huh.
And that's when he fled to Arizona.
So you actually just talked to people who say they have seen him, have known him
yes,
in all these
I have.
years. Wow.
Now,
that's rather...
It's hard to explain...
It's going to be hard to
the bottom
prove
line as to why they did what they did.
Mm-hmm. So in your mind, you feel there's a better than 50% chance that he actually lived to 93.
Yes. Now, the problem was, of course, after the war went on, it got to other people were involved in the side issues, the concentration camps, and all of that is a very sticky mess and a sticky wicket. And how many died in the camps, didn't die in the camps, I don't even want to get into because it's a very, very sticky and controversial mess. Claims and counterclaims, everybody knows this, everybody's read it.
It's just a lot of people, basically.
Yeah, a lot of people died in the camps without any question. Mm-hmm. We'll leave it that way.
But why the hatred toward the Jews?
He felt that they were the ones, as I read it, felt that they were the ones who were responsible for the problems of Germany in World War I, because historically the Kaiser was ready to call the war quits in 1916. He actually approached the English government. He says, look, you're losing the war. I don't want anything out of this. Let's just end the war, silly war here. I want no territorial encroachments or advancements. I don't want anything to be out of this. End the war, leave all the boundaries the way they are, and let's be friends, so to speak. most of the British government went along with this. Because this was what the Kaiser of Germany said, and he approached the English government. It was in a stalemate at that point in 1916. Yeah. And everyone except the then Premier, Prime Minister of England, was willing to go along with it. He wasn't. Now, historically speaking, and of course he was going to step on some toes, but historically speaking, he had a lot of Jewish friends, and they told him, you don't have to do this. We can arrange for you and see to it that you will win the war. We'll get the United States in on your side in the war, and you'll win it against the Germans. Well, how do I do this? He says, just do what we tell you. And the first thing they did, of course, going through the United States to the then President Woodrow Wilson in period 1914 and 1918, and a little beyond, of course. They had Woodrow Wilson, because he was beholden to certain interests in the U.S., who got the lawsuit off of his neck, having been a little bit too amorous as the president of Princeton University with one of the other people's wives. That was held up. He was being sued. The suit was paid, and they said, we'll fix it up for you, but you are beholden to us, and we want a favor out of you in the future. The favor was that you will appoint the first Jewish justice to the United States Supreme Court, was Chief Justice Brandeis in 1916. And you will also be looking for the time and the point where you will get the United States into war on the side of England against Germany. And, of course, the hue and cry was, remember the Lusitania, which was sunk in 1916, by the way, not 1917. In fact, it was a little earlier than 1916. But then there was another hue and cry about a ship being sunk in the Thames River, a boat which had a lot of American citizens on it. Well, this went to Congress. Congress declared war. And, of course, we came on the side of England. And, of course, we beat Germany. 6 months after this incident with the riverboat on the Thames occurred, it seems like it was still plying up and down on the Thames, and it was suddenly discovered that the ship had never been hit. The whole thing was a manufactured incident. What do? Say, whoops, we made a mistake, we're not in the war? You can hardly
Not at that point.
Not at that point, you don't. Hitler's view on this was, right or wrong, this was his view, that the Jews were involved in the background and controlled banking. The Rothschilds controlled all the banking in Europe. There were other Jewish as well as non-Jewish bankers, who weren't all Jewish, controlling the banking interests of Europe, of England, and so forth. And they arranged for the loss of World War I, and they were setting up Europe again for something. And, of course, they wanted Germany held down. That was his viewpoint, and he was against the whole Jewish cabal, the whole Jewish interest, and wanted all of the Jewish bankers out of Germany, and he got them all out.
Well, Al, but I'm trying to tie this together with what you're saying, that he lived to 1993 because he did something right. Now, it seemed
in somebody's view, yes.
In somebody's view. So the question is, who's controlling the agenda here?
That is correct.
And do you think it could be someone beyond the bankers, the Rothschilds?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Go into that for a second.
You have another aspect here. Who do the bankers belong to? That is, in terms of their private organizations. All of the bankers have other groups they belong to. Today, of course, we know about such groups as the Bilderbergers, Council of Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, the Club of Rome, which is older than any of those, and the Illuminati, which goes back much further. They're all connected together, and they all have their own little agendas of what they want to do, the way they want to divide up Europe or control Europe or unify Europe. Today, they want to unify Europe. And they have a long-term plan. And the long-term plan doesn't cover just 10 or 20 years. It's 50 to 100 years in advance. And they see what they want to do. And these people are not stupid, I must add. They are very intelligent. They're very high IQ. But they look at it their own way as to what they think is, in their view, they are given the right to rule the world and rule Europe and eventually the world. They think they know what's best for everybody.
Where do they get this view from, though?
That's the good question there. The Council of the Illuminati, which is one of the top organizations, has some very strange members. I'm not familiar with all of them who are currently on there. In fact, I only knew about 2 or 3. But there is one interesting aspect, and this is verified to me personally by a friend who has been there with the council meetings. I said, tell me, is the chairman of the council human? And he says, no, absolutely not. I already knew the answer, but I was asking him. I said, you saw what the chairman was? He said, yes. What was the chairman? He says, the Draco, 9 feet tall. So there is your connection to outside. And there's a lot of other connections that go on.
Now, is the Draco part of the reptilian group?
Yes, basically is a reptilian, except he's not a reptilian in terms of, in terms of what is normally considered the Orion group reptilians. The Draconians, as such, come from Draco Major, and they consider themselves the, shall we say, the royalty of the reptilian class. They consider themselves as the rulers of the reptilians.
Okay, so you think that ultimately they have the power?
They and other groups have the powers, and this, of course, is not just limited to Europe, and it's not limited to the bankers.
Worldwide.
Today, it's worldwide, and it goes into every major government on Earth. And how it's concealed and covered, of course, is the, shall we say, the agenda for all of the secrecy and the super-secrecy in every government on Earth. They don't want the people to know who's in the background and why.
And there must be a reason for that.
There has to be a reason, yes. I'm not going to say I know the reason.
Okay, why don't you hypothesize then?
You can hypothesize that they want to take over the planet, they want to cut down the size of the human population, or they want to control the human population because we have achieved a point of technology and mass production that we become quite literally an arsenal, not for democracy, but an arsenal for galactic war. Build the hardware for them to carry on their wars out there. And since, let us say, we are an arsenal, probably, and this of course is my conjecture, probably they are providing a certain amount of protection to planet Earth against invasion from outside. Since we've already been invaded, it's a matter of who's controlling us and to what end.
Well, see, my own hypothesis is that a population is easier to control that doesn't know that they are being controlled.
Absolutely correct. And that is the way it's being run today. Mm-hmm. You have all kinds of mind control techniques. You have all kinds of programs to distract humanity, to distract us with TV and the programs. Put in little bits and pieces here and there on the sci-fi shows referring to aliens to get the idea embedded in the subconscious. Well, maybe there could be aliens. But if anybody comes up and say, are there any aliens? A hardcore statement on, let's say, a news program? Of course not. We've never seen any evidence of this. Ho, ho, ho. Every expert in the field, every political expert will deny it, even if they have seen them.
It's almost so absurd it's funny.
It is absurd, and it is funny.
Yeah.
Sick funny, I might add.
Well, speaking about funny, we have really gotten off track here, but it's been interesting, and perhaps maybe we can cycle this around back to. We're trying to
at a later point.
Yeah, which was when your memories were starting to come back. We're trying to figure out how was it that you really knew that you had been part of the Philadelphia experiment. We got to 88.
Well, we can look
How'd
at it.
You know?
We can look at it this way. That is the point in 88. January, when my memories came back. Prior to that, I wouldn't say it was not a cold turkey remembrance. It was something I was ready for because I had already been researching the whole problem of the Philadelphia experiment for at least 20 years prior.
So you always had an interest in it?
I always had an interest in it from the 50s.
Now, did you think that perhaps, and I'm sure other people might state this of you, that you just made all this up in your head?
Well, of course some people have made that statement.
I mean, it's just going to be too easy to do.
I couldn't make up the details and have them corroborated by a dozen or two other people when they were still alive.
So details came back to you that you would have had no way of knowing about.
That's right, and others verified it.
And then you had the memory, you probably even wrote some of it down.
Yeah.
Certainly you spoke about it.
Oh, yes.
And then others said, yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
And perhaps filled in other details. Is that what happened?
Yeah, and there are people who had some of the files in their hands and verified what I remembered.
Oh, so that's even better.
Yes. And, of course, the one specific individual who had the actual files from the Philadelphia experiment in his hands from the Navy was working on Long Island at that time on a special project involving UFOs, and they wanted him to recreate certain hardware that went back to the 40s.
I think we can talk about that. Was that Preston? Because he's going to talk about that.
Right. He
So you're saying
asked for prior art. He says, I need to know what was done before if I'm going to recreate certain types of hardware. I need this, this, and this. And then he stuck in, for good measure, I want to see the files in the Philadelphia experiment. Because, in a sense, it was connected. And he said, yes, we'll get them for you. Of course, they kept them under lock and key when he wasn't using them at his desk, and he had them for about 2 weeks. And boy, did he feed me information out of those files. He finally asked the man who gave them to him, who was at that time, the either assistant director or the director of the Office of Naval Research, who got them for him, because it was that high up that he was going.
Did you physically see him, or did he just verbally tell you about it?
He verbally told me about it.
Because there's no way he could have taken those out at the
He
time.
asked the man who gave them to him, he says, why can't Al see these records? And I can quote the comment that was made by Preston, which was quoting the man who made the comment. He says, quote, Al will never see the records, unquote. And this was by the director of the Office of Naval Research, who was personally interfaced with Preston at that time.
Do you remember that gentleman's name?
Not at this point now.
Okay.
There's not the same man now.
I'm sure. This was a while ago. Well, let's maybe move up a little bit. There's some key people who are part of this story that you sort of met. There's Duncan and there's Preston. These are two key people. How did you here? You're still Al Bielek, but how did you go about forming a relationship with these people, and then finally saying, I know you from somewhere, and then getting all this additional data that corroborates it?
Getting to the point of knowing I know them, like Duncan in specific terms. I knew him from somewhere as early as 1983. This is before any of the memories came back.
Oh, so this is even before the 88
That's correct.
incident. Okay, now how did you actually meet Duncan in 83?
I met him I didn't meet him in 83. I met Preston in 83. But in 1985, I met Duncan at a conference, the United States Psychotronics Association conference at Dayton, Ohio, at the summer session. Preston was there. He brought with him his, quote, new lab assistant, unquote, who was helping him with one of the demonstrations.
Were you one of the presidents or the founders of this organization?
I was one of the founders.
You were?
In 1975, I was at the founding meeting. And he introduced me to Duncan. Looks like a nice guy. And finally, after one of the demonstrations, which Preston gave on stage, where Duncan was there as part of it, I said, this guy is extreme sensitive. I want to talk with him. So I got him to that next day over lunch in the cafeteria, because we were in a school setting.
Could you feel it?
Yeah.
How did you know he's extreme sensitive?
I could feel it. Because I am. I mean, one sensitive knows another.
I hear you.
And I got him over lunch and we started talking about many things and so forth. And this went on for almost 3 hours after lunch. And about halfway through, maybe 2 hours of this, I said, Duncan, have you got a feeling by any chance that you know me from somewhere? He says, yeah. I says, do you have any idea where from? He says, not the foggiest. I have no idea where from, but I do know I know you from somewhere. And he says, well, I got the same feeling, but I have no idea either where it's from. But before we left that conference, two things happened. One, I decided that I probably knew Duncan from a prior existence, which of course happened to be true. The prior existence at the time didn't gel, but it was the Philadelphia experiment as well as others.
See, a lot of people would think that was a past life or something.
Oh,
but
it was for Duncan. It was for Duncan, but it wasn't for me.
Well, it kind of was for you, because you were Ed Cameron then.
That's right.
But Duncan was still Duncan Cameron.
That's correct.
Okay.
But at the same time, number two item was that Preston invited me to visit him in Long Island sometime at his lab, because he says, I'm always looking for good engineers for some of the projects I'm working on. He was working full-time at that time, and he was also working in his lab and had some other projects in mind. That was July of 1985, and in August of 85, I went to Long Island, intending to spend a weekend. I stayed 2 weeks at Duncan's place.
Was this the same house that you grew up in as
No.
Ed Cameron? Different house?
No, this was the lodge. After our father, Duncan's father, and my father, the real one, died, he left some money to Duncan and also this hunting lodge, as he called it, on Babylon, the town of Babylon, but on the island out there, Babylon Island. And he inherited it, and Duncan moved out on the island. He's been living in that house ever since. But that's where I stayed and visited with him in Preston. And Preston and I did various things together. And we did some probing and questioning and so on, and I became more and more convinced that Duncan was my missing brother, because I had a feeling and awareness that I had a missing brother as far back as 1947. And all checking through the Bielek family indicated I had no brothers or sisters. I was told I was the only kid of the Bieleks.
But you always had a feeling there was another one.
That's right. I always had the feeling, at least from 1947 on, I had a brother. And I was aware of the fact that he was reborn and had died and was reborn in 1951, which was a fact. He was reborn as Duncan Cameron II in 1951.
And what year did he actually die in, though?
I assumed it was around 47, because it's hard to say when he actually died, but that was when I got the feeling that he died in 47. He'd actually died in the future, in 1982 or 83 at Montauk. But he disappeared from the Eldridge in 43. Now, I don't know why in 47 I got this feeling that he died, but I did. Mm-hmm. It was very depressing for me for 4 years. When I knew he was reborn, I got out of that depression mode. I met the person in 85, and I became convinced that he was the missing brother. Well, in 85, Preston took Duncan and myself out to Montauk Point. At that point, Preston didn't know that he, I, or Duncan had ever been part of the Montauk Project. He only told us, I'm going to take you out to a place in eastern Long Island. I want to see what you guys pick up about this place. I said, I know you're both sensitives, but I'm not going to tell you anything about it in advance.
Did you have did you have any feelings about Preston at that time when you first met him?
Yes and no. I had a subconscious feeling that I knew him from somewheres, but it never came to the surface because I had no outward reason that I could put my finger on to think that I knew him. So I ignored that feeling. It wasn't strong. It was sort of a subterranean type feeling that maybe I know him too, but I ignored it.
Okay, so he took you guys out to Montauk.
Right. First thing we saw was a radar tower 5 miles away from the Montauk Point. So he takes us out to the point, parks the vehicle, and shows us the way in on the base where the fences are down and everything is wide open and the place is abandoned. We walk all over the place. There's abandoned buildings. We go in one or two, and we went in the radar tower, which was wide open then. And I started to get this eerie feeling. I said, there's something strange about this place from Preston. I said, there was some monstrous project going on here, an enormous project. I said, I got the feeling that there was some kind of a strange monster walking around on this base at some point. I said, this thing was at least 12 feet high, if not more. And I said, I don't know whether it's physically pounding around or etherically, but I got the feeling it was there, and in a sense, it's still here. And I asked Duncan, do you pick anything up on this? He says, yeah, I can feel the same damn thing. So we both verified it. We both felt there was a monster there. Well, subsequent events showed that there was, and that was what shut the station down that night of 12 August 83. But we both picked it up that day. We didn't go in the area where the monster was still sitting, though he was not visible to the eyesight, as we found out later. And we saw a building which had been squashed by, like, literally somebody had come down on the top of it with a huge hand and like a hammer and smashed the building because it was hit from the top and splattered out. Approaching dusk, we both decided, and we all decided, it might not be healthy to stay around here at night. So we left. That was as far as it went at that time. Now I went back. This is August of '85.
So when you went to the base, there was no guards, no
guards.
Military.
No one was there. Nothing was there.
Completely
100% abandoned.
Wow.
The gates had been beaten down. People wandering in there. Souvenir hunters were going through the buildings, picking up anything loose they could, because there was electronic equipment all over the place in the buildings. Some of it was smashed. Some of it had been obviously pirated. Some of the smaller pieces of equipment had been taken. The main tube computer, and I do say tube computer, built by AL, was a nice nameplate on it, and everything in the radar tower was still there, essentially intact. They didn't even take the tubes out. There's a very large piece of equipment.
So it's like the military just ran out of there.
Well, that's what we found out later. They quite literally picked up and ran out that night of 12 August 83. And we pieced that story together much later, but not at that point. We didn't know what happened then. So I left, went back to Phoenix. Couldn't get work there, and Preston says, "Why don't you move out on the island? There's a lot of work out here." I said, okay, I did. I moved out to the island actually August of '86, but before I did that, in May of '86, I made another trip. And that trip was in conjunction with a group in Phoenix that I had talked to about the station and the feeling I had that some enormous project had taken place there. It was all this wreckage all over the place. And it turned out that the one of the three people I talked with, who were students at ASU, Arizona State University in Tempe, one of them was the nephew of Senator Barry Goldwater. I didn't know that at the time.
Oh, you talked with him?
I talked with him. Mm-hmm. And he was trying to sort me out. He was asking me about Tesla and certain Tesla projects. We hear you know quite a bit about Tesla. We'd like some help with this. I said, okay, maybe I can help you with it. But in the process, before Christmas of 1985, I mentioned the trip to Montauk and what I had seen out there and so forth, and he got very interested in this. Turns out that in May of '86, he and his two friends had already been introduced to are sent out on a trip to Montauk, Long Island, to find out the extent and history of what had gone out there, and is there evidence of money having been subverted from a regular project to a secret clandestine project at Montauk Point.
Well, did his father, Barry Goldwater, send him out there?
It wasn't his father, it was his uncle.
His
uncle sent him. We found that out shortly thereafter. His uncle was the one that sent him because his uncle got interested. He was also a radio amateur and into electronics, even though he was a military man who had been general in the Air Force and was interested in UFOs, among other things. Anything unusual, he had a very strong interest in. But in any case, he started an investigation through channels to see if there was any evidence of a project at Montauk Point, and could find no evidence of any kind, no money being spent out there. It didn't make any sense to him. He says, if this is all out there, he says, somebody had to spend money on it, and there's not a trace of evidence in any of the reports of the Senate or the House and the oversight committees. He was chairman of the Senate Oversight Committee for Military Affairs, found no evidence of a big project out there.
Didn't he actually go out there one time?
I'm not sure whether he personally went or not. I suspect he did, but I'm not sure of it.
I heard somewhere that he did.
He may well have. After this trip that his nephew and the other two made, at his behest, paying all expenses, go through all the buildings. They had approval from the state of New York and the Parks Commission to get in any building they wanted, and if it was locked, they would get the keys for it. And they wanted a thorough investigation. Well, we were out there with a camera crew and everything else.
Oh, so you actually went with the two boys?
I went out there knowing they were going to be there, and I was there. Duncan was there, Preston was there, and a whole bunch of people were there. When they held down a suite of rooms in a motel just outside of the town of Montauk, near the point. And we did some other things there which were all videotaped. Everything on that trip was videotaped.
Does that video exist anymore, or is that
yes,
all gone?
they do, basically. Mm-hmm. Preston has most of that footage. I have part of it on something which Preston gave me. But in any case, they never found any evidence of subversion of money or what have you, but just more evidence that there was a huge project ongoing out there at one time.
So they couldn't find the entrances to the underground tunnels?
No, that was totally sealed off. We found a couple of sealed entrances, if you will, where concrete had been poured in. We checked the elevator shaft, which is in the radar tower, to see if it went down below the ground level, and it sure did. We dropped rocks in there, and you could calculate from the sound how long it took to get down, of course, how far down they went. It went down far enough to say it went down one level. We could hear it hitting something, which said either that was the bottom level or there was a concrete plug in there. Later on, we learned there was a concrete plug because that elevator went down 8 levels. And the stones didn't go down 8 levels. And it was totally inoperative. There's no power to operate anything at that point. So we came away from that, and during that period, it was when I became aware of the fact that I had been involved in the Montauk project. Now, before I arrived on that second trip in May, Duncan and Preston had made many trips to Montauk, partly because Preston had a license to go out and do salvage, and had the authority from the state to take out anything he wanted. He could take out on his back. He didn't have authority to take a truck in. But he said, anything you can carry out, you're welcome to carry out. And he had a license to do it, because he was an electronic surplus dealer, among other things. So he had taken a few pieces of equipment out, quite a lot, in fact. But they made many trips before I arrived in May of '86. And they kept telling me on the phone, he says, you were part of the Montauk Project. And I said, I was not. And he said, oh, yes, you were. We remember it very distinctly.
Who said it? Would Preston said that?
And Duncan, both.
Both.
They both said it.
At what point did Duncan acknowledge that he was your brother?
Came later. It was not at that point yet.
Not yet, okay.
And I says, well, I said, all I can say truthfully was, I have no recollection of it. He says, okay, we'll accept that statement, but we know you were part of it. And he says, you were a major part of it, too, by the way. He says, all right. Made my trip out there to the point in the May and came back to Preston's lab one afternoon. And Preston had to go out someplace. And Preston says, you might as well wait here. I'll be gone maybe an hour or two. And I said, okay, I'll wait until you get back. We'll go to dinner later. So I sat there in his lab, surrounded by part of the equipments which had been taken out of Montauk, including IBM drives of various kinds, hard disk drives, big ones. And I says, okay, these guys say I was part of the Montauk Project. I don't recall it. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that I was. Okay, so what? What does it mean? At that point, I started to shake like a leaf, and I mean really shake. And I said, oh, shit. I said, this means that there is something buried here that I have not yet faced. I knew enough about digging information out, because I've been doing this for years through another channel, other things that I've been involved with. And
again, yet, this is '86, right?
This is '86.
Okay. And in '88, when you found out about the Philadelphia experiment, did you also have the same shaking thing?
No, I did not.
Okay.
That was more straightforward. The thing for the Montauk was quite heavily buried, but I started to have the shakes. And this went on for a period of time, and I said, oh, shit. I said, I know I was involved now. I said, this has to be. Well, finally, late that afternoon, I tried to relax and see what kind of memories come up. First thing that came up was 1956, sitting on the seawall outside the Royal Hawaiian Hotel that famous night. I assume now it was a Saturday night, I'm not sure. But I remember sitting there on the seawall and the fact that I'd passed out, and okay, what happened? And from that point, it all started to connect. I was pulled somehow out of there and wound up in the office of the director of the Montauk Project, the station master, as we call him, Jack Pruitt.
Okay, now we are going to get into the whole Montauk thing on the next show.
Okay.
On the next show. So
but I'll finish up the short part of this.
Okay.
That was where my memories came back, that I was part of the Montauk Project and everything that came with it, and, of course, other aspects later. But that was the opening point. And that night when Preston came back, I said to him, okay, Preston, you're right. I was part of the Montauk Project. I says, oh? He said, yes, I remembered it finally. So we had discussions with Duncan and so forth, and we went to dinner that night. And this was, of course, in May of '86, and then at a later point, I decided, okay, I'll move to the island, and I did in August of '86, and I was there until March of '87. I had a good job with the company, but they saw fit, like so many other good jobs I've had, to can me, but they didn't can me for incompetence or anything like that. It canned me because his bean counters told him, his accountants, if you will.
Overhead.
You got to cut back. You have bills aren't being paid by one of the major aircraft companies. One of them on the island owed him 6 months of back monies for developments of hardware that he'd done for them.
Is that Grumman?
Grumman. Mm-hmm. It was Grumman. And the bean counters told him, you got to cut back. So he started. The last one in was the first one out, me. And I had a nice job with him, $50,000 a year.
Now, when Preston first saw you at that Psychotronics meeting,
yeah,
did he already know who you were?
No, he did not. He had no idea at the time. He did not know.
When did he start remembering?
Sometime between the August 1985 meeting and the time when I arrived, or the July '85 meeting. and the time when I arrived on the second trip to Montauk, which was, of course, May 86. It was in that interim period. We went out, of course, in August of 85. After that, he and Duncan made many trips, and he started deprogramming Duncan, and they both became aware of the fact that they were involved in it because of all of the trips. And the fact is, you go back to the scene of the crime, so to speak, it's a very powerful stimulus, and the feels on that base were enormously powerful. They would kick anybody that had any kind of memory back into what was there and what were you involved in. So it hit them.
So he worked on deprogramming Duncan.
Yes.
And at the point, though, did he already have his memories, or did he do that, and in the process of deprogramming Duncan, he deprogrammed himself?
I can't answer that aspect. I don't know.
We'll have to
Someplace
ask
along
him.
the line, the memories for Preston came back.
Okay.
And Duncan, maybe the same time, maybe slightly separate. That I don't know.
Now, did Duncan have a hard time accepting the fact that you were his brother?
A very hard time.
He did?
Yes.
Why so?
He didn't want to accept the idea because...
that he was involved?
No, he didn't want to accept the idea that I was his brother. It didn't feel right to him at the time. Now, I might add, this was before his memories of the Philadelphia experiment came back. See, he came back with the Montauk thing first in late 85, early 86. Then I came out there, and I was there until March of 87 when I left and went back to Phoenix and did other work then in the area around Phoenix. But it was after that, because of many of the problems that developed with Duncan and deprogramming him regarding his connection with the Phoenix operation, the Montauk Project, as it was under the heading of the Phoenix Project. He had a lot of problems, and he had a great deal of trouble accepting the fact that he was A, in the chair, and B, that he was one of the principal programmers for the Montauk Boys. That bothered him no end. So in the process of trying to dig that out and resolve it, under hypnosis, Preston started to regress him age-wise, trying to find out what the connections were and what's going on here. He took him back to the age of 12. At the age of 12, everything seemed to be normal in terms of Duncan's family background. And he says, all right, go earlier than the age of 12. And this is what was told to me later after it had happened, of course. And he jumped back to the Eldridge. And he says, I'm on the decks of some crazy ship. And he says, I understand it's the Eldridge. And he says, there are people here that I know today, speaking of his current time, meaning in 1987, 86, 87. He says, one of them is Al. He says, I knew Al in the Eldridge. I still didn't connect that it was his brother. And that was his eye-opening to the fact that he was heavily involved in the Montauk, the Philadelphia experiment. And eventually he remembered more parts of that. And then, of course, this was before I remembered that I was involved in the Philadelphia experiment. And finally it got to the point where Preston and Duncan were telling me that I was involved in the Philadelphia experiment. And I didn't remember it. And I said, I don't know. I said, I've been interested in this thing, but I don't have no memory of it.
Were they telling you that before you saw the movie?
If I remember correctly, yes. But they didn't. No, wait a minute. That's wrong. Now I remember the sequences that happened. They recalled, under hypnosis, the fact that Duncan was involved with it, but they did not tell me until after I remembered it. The only part they encouraged me about was the Montauk series sequence, which I already went into. They did not tell me, and it became a point of interest to me when I remembered. I finally called up Preston. I says, Preston, I was involved in the Philadelphia experiment. And he says, yes, I know. He says, what do you mean you know? If you knew, why didn't you tell me? He says, we weren't going to tell you until you remembered it independently. He says, what do you mean? He says, well, I ran Duncan through hypnosis, and we came up that he was involved in the Philadelphia experiment. And they said, we weren't going to tell you because of the fact we wanted you to corroborate it independently without any coaching from us.
Where did Preston learn how to hypnotize people? I mean, that's certainly not his background.
That was not his normal background, that's true.
He's into electronics.
Officially, he was into electronics, but unofficially, he was involved in some of the mystical groups. And he spent time with some of the research into some of the ancient mystical societies and some of the work that was done in the Orient, and he took part in some of this. I don't know his background fully on that, but I know he was involved in some of those Oriental groups, learning some of these techniques that they were in. I do not know how thoroughly, how extensive it was. And he also, as a result of his regression and trying to get back into the Montauk Project and other things in his own earlier part of his life, he started to recall the fact that he was once in one of the Shaolin temples. Now, this may have been another lifetime, but he did have recall of that. And I'm not clear as to what exactly his connection was. But he had the ability, he learned the ability to hypnotize, he learned some other abilities, he learned body language and a private schooling type thing. He was interested in it, so he learned that very well, and that helped him with a lot of looking at these people to see, from body language you can tell if somebody is hiding something, they're holding back. It's very easy if you know what to look for. And he learned what to look for. Part of that was involved in his deprogramming Duncan. But in the deprogramming of Duncan, in terms of the Montauk Project, was when, under hypnosis, it came up that he was part of the Philadelphia experiment. This occurred about 3 months before I made the memory recollection. So this was in late 97.
Oh, 97.
When he recalled and recovered this, and when Duncan recalled that he is part of the Philadelphia experiment. I would put
That's not too long ago.
No, 97. I mean 87.
87, okay.
I would say that he recalled about November of 87.
Okay, this seems very strange to me in a sense that by day he'd be working to try to deprogram you and figure out what's going on, and Duncan be trying to figure out what's going on, and then sort of by night, you guys are all working together on this Montauk project. Was there that overlap there?
Yes, there is an overlap. Preston was probably involved with the with the Montauk project from the beginning, meaning about 1968, 69. At some point in there, he came in on it. I don't know exactly when, but he was there before the 76 beginning of testing of the full Montauk operation, meaning the time tunnels and all of this. And all of the alien connections were put into place about 1969, 1970, after the Germans moved in, and after Dr. Herman C. Unterman was named as a technical director. I'm not sure exactly when that happened, but it was before 76. In fact, I was the one that pinpointed that Herman C. Unterman was the technical director, and Preston said to me at the time, he says, "Unterman, did you say?" I said, "Yes." He says, "I know that guy." I says, "Where do you know him from?" He says, "I remember him from MIT." I says, "MIT? What were you doing at MIT?" He says, "I was teaching Saturday classes at MIT on metaphysics or something." He says it was sort of an off-the-cuff type thing, and Unterman was one of my students. I says, "Unterman was one of your students?" And he says, "Yeah." And at this point, he had not remembered his connection with the Montauk Project, but later on, when I finally got it to him, I said, he was part of this thing, and he was a technical director.
Okay, now I'm timelining again. Did you say it was 83 that it got shut down, when the monster was there?
83 was the shutdown on the night of 12 August.
Okay, and a lot of these things you're talking about are 86, 88, right? When the memories started coming back.
That is
right?
correct. It was only a few years after.
And it's interesting, 12 August 83 is when you arrived.
It was 12 August in the wee hours, let's say about 2 a.m., when Duncan and I arrived from the Eldridge in our original format, if you will.
That day. And that's the same day the base got shut down.
That's right.
That's
See, the sequence there is very important because what happened was we arrived, we were there about 12 hours, and prior to that, about 6 weeks prior to our arrival, Duncan, Preston, and certain other people of the higher echelons, not myself, put the plot together to destroy the station. But they had to wait until, because they found out about the records and knew about it, they had to wait until after Duncan, Duncan, the original, and myself, Ed Cameron, were to arrive at the station, be there, and then leave. They couldn't destroy the station before we had left. And they knew we were coming. Von Neumann knew we were coming. Von Neumann knew about the plot to destroy the station, but he says you can't do it before that point. And, of course, he was against it totally. I was against it as Al Bielek, because I was there as Al Bielek at the same time I was to arrive as Ed Cameron. About 3 days before the arrival, they told me to go take a hike, take a vacation. You know, we don't want you around here for the next few days. They didn't tell me what was going to happen.
Did they say the same to Duncan?
Duncan, they kept on station, but in another location. They made sure he was nowhere as near where the arrival would be for the original Duncan.
Then you'd have the paradox problem.
Exactly. That they knew they had to avoid. So Duncan and I were there for that approximate 12 hours. After we left in the middle of the afternoon, had known we were gone, had been returned to the Eldridge. That was when Preston got Duncan, sat him down in the chair, and put him through whatever he put him through to put him in that relaxed reverie state, and then gave him the command that time is now, or whatever the set of words were, which would turn on the pre-arranged command that he would dredge up from his subconscious some kind of a monster resembling a Sasquatch and come out of his mind. The station would give it physical clothing, if you will, put it into our physical 3D reality, which had long since been established that the station could be used for. It was established in the early testing in 75, 76.
They could take thought and put it
convert
into
it to
form.
a physical reality.
Okay, now, I've heard, when this issue has been discussed, I have heard that that's the Bigfoot character that we see, and it was just kind of floating around, and it appeared in as a synchronistic thing. But
I don't know exactly the sequence because I wasn't there, but Duncan thought about it.
Are you relaying a story from Preston?
I'm relaying a story from Preston as how he saw it, and there were other people who saw it also.
And Duncan as well? Did he see it as well?
Duncan perhaps did not see it because he was sort of half out of it.
Right.
He was in a...
He was sort of the conduit, wasn't he?
He was the conduit.
Yeah.
He was therefore half out of it. And in the state in which he usually was in that chair, he was not physically conscious of what was going on. He was conscious at another level. So the thing came, it arrived, it was physically clothed, and it went stomping out around the base. And this was sometime late afternoon, 4 or 5 o'clock maybe. I'm not sure what time.
Did it look like a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch?
Yes, the photos we have of it show it as such.
Who took the photos?
They came in 1986 on that trip in May by a commercial photographer. It's a series of photos. It's on videotape. Preston has footage on videotape of them. I have pictures from that period, also from 1993.
Yeah, I have seen some in your book, in the book that Preston did, but it's very vague, very foggy.
It's a little on the foggy side, but in any case, it wasn't foggy at the time he was stomping around the base.
I'll bet.
There were people who saw this and ran. The word got back immediately to Jack Pruitt, the station master. This was going on, and Jack got totally upset. He says, well, we've got to shut that thing down, shut down Montauk, shut down the tower. So they went for the main power control circuits.
Oh, they had to shut it down because that's the only way to get rid of the monster, right?
Exactly.
Got it.
They went to shut down the main power feeds to the tower, and like on the Eldridge, the handles were frozen. So he says, okay, find the cables and cut them. So they found a set of power feed cables, which power was all coming from Lilco at that time. They'd long since abandoned the power station. And they found cables, they cut them. Nothing happened. And they scratched their head, and Pruitt said, there's got to be another set of feed cables. And they found another set, cut those, the lights went out, but the station kept running. Well, at that point, it was obvious, as we discussed later, that the station had achieved that point of theory becoming fact that Einstein had warned about years before, which was that if you create a machine of sufficient complexity and give it enough power, and eventually in time it will become intelligent of itself. And the computer complex in the tower had done just that. It was feeding itself power out of what you could call the Dirac Sea.
Now that's a scary thought. I mean, that's something I have in my own mind, of a machine having sentient power.
It became exactly that. For years they've been fed all of the prime mathematics, the prime equations for everything from invisibility to God knows what, to creating the tunnel, to outer space, hyperspace, you name it. It had everything in its computer memories and the computer bank, so it could do its own compilation.
So it became its own person in a sense.
It became its own person, yes.
Do you recall if this hardware was hardware which is in use today?
No, that hardware has been dismantled.
Was that from alien technology?
A lot of it was, but everything was built by us, meaning various companies here on Earth. But the concepts were alien. That part of it.
So I can't go to Gateway or Dell and buy one of these sentient computers.
Not quite. You would have to have special quartz crystal time delay lines built by Corning Works, which were 16 inches on a side and absolutely optical flat. We didn't think anybody could build those things at the time, but they did. A whole nest of them were built in this hermetically sealed container. We had 2 of those, and we took one apart to see what was in it. That was part of the secret part of the system. The concepts were highly classified. The way the hardware was connected was classified, but apparently it eventually became capable of running itself.
So how did they actually shut it down?
Well, when they realized what was going on, Pruitt said to Preston, who was there, he says, "You're going to go in there and shut this thing down." He says, "I'm not going in there." He says, "Here's a portable acetylene torch with a tank you can put on his back and a cutting torch." He says, "You're going to go in there and cut it down." He says, "No, I'm not." So Pruitt pulled out a .45 and held it to Preston's head. He says, "Yes, you are." Preston says, "I guess I am." and he went.
You know, I'm seeing pictures of the 2001 HAL computer right now in my mind.
In a sense, that was absolutely correct. Anyway,
I was
he went
hoping
in there
it would just be...
He cut all of the cable feeds between the computer, between the output stages of the 2 final RF amplifiers, which were feeding back into certain other areas.
Did the computer try to stop him?
Well, it had no way to stop him. Had no robot there. And apparently they didn't call in Junior to try and get Junior to stop him. Why, I don't know.
Who was Junior?
Junior was what we called the monster.
Oh, yeah.
We gave him a nickname, Junior. I thought it was an appropriate name afterwards. But
how long was the monster actually there?
Actually, he was running around for about, I think, 4 hours. And it was trying to get in the radar tower, but it couldn't break through. It was too strong. I mean, the construction of the tower was too strong.
And it was just one monster.
Yeah, it was only one. Didn't multiply. And went in there and cut up enough of the cabling, cut up the interconnects between the main computer and other computers, between various systems in there, and eventually, when they cut enough sections of the brain apart, the whole thing collapsed. Couldn't feed itself power anymore, because all of the controlling equations and knowledge was just chopped out. So it was shut down, and Junior disappeared. Or became locked in a physical location where you could see it with the right, not even the right cameras. Any ordinary 35 millimeter camera with ordinary film photographed it. My camera, another guy's camera, videotape, etc. Nobody could see the creature, if you will. It was out of our reality, and partially in another one, but yet still partially back in ours, sufficiently that you could photograph it. That was really weird.
Was it frozen?
It was frozen and motionless.
Wow. Do you think that's where all these Bigfoots come from?
No.
No,
there are real Bigfoots, particularly out in Oregon.
Lots of them.
Lots of them.
You think those are just living there, having a good old life? Have nothing to
living
do
there,
with...
According to the information I got from various sources, including one woman who was abducted by them and taken to their camp, and was later either allowed to escape or she escaped on her own. So there's a whole colony of these things, and they do talk. They understand English. They're highly intelligent. But what they're doing here, she didn't know, and it began to appear to those who researched the problem of the Bigfoot that the Bigfoot do have communities. They're apparently placed here by various UFO groups, and they're playing some kind of an experiment or game of their own to see whether the Bigfoot can live on Earth. For what reason, we don't know.
Mm-hmm. But why do you think it was a Bigfoot that was brought into the base?
Well,
it wasn't
a Bigfoot per se. It was something out of Duncan's subconscious, and what came out of his subconscious was an image of a Bigfoot. I do not know where he got it. But this was buried in his subconscious. Now, whether Duncan had a specific image set up by Preston, I don't know. They could have.
Does Preston recall that?
Not that I know of. I don't know if I even asked him that question.
So you believe Duncan and Preston were the main two people who were involved to
They were.
to destroy this base, and that's what came up as a solution.
They were the main two.
Okay. Well, we've covered a lot of territory here right now. We're going to take a break and get to the next topic. Is there anything else you want to say to sort of end this conversation right here?
Yes, there was obviously a lot of classified documentation of the operation of the Montauk scenario. And also it was made a note to me by Preston that they filmed everything that went on at Montauk. They had 20 rolls of 16 millimeter movie film, the big rolls.
Who's they?
The station masters, the recording people were there because they did document everything that went on there. And apparently it was all on motion picture film. Preston said, and I've never seen him, claimed that he went back in on the base sometime after the collapse when everything was wide open. He found his way into the underground. He said at that time there was still one or two areas to get in which had not been sealed off, were rather obscure. He found one of them, went in, found in the underground this cache of motion picture film because he knew they were there. He found out where they were, and he brought all 20 reels out, kept them at his place for a while, and then stashed them in some special place upstate New York that he maintained. And he was always going to show them to somebody who never did, and the next thing he knew, this was after I arrived on the scene, and was at the point where I remembered what had happened, that he told me that, well, somebody came up there to New York State, and of course I'm quoting Preston. I can't say he even had him in the first place. This is his story.
We'll ask him about that. Yeah.
Yes, might be a good point.
Okay.
He said that everything he had stored upstate was destroyed. Somebody came in and first they fired the barn, then they bulldozed everything, and all the films were lost, and everything else he had stored up there. He went out of his way to find a place that was totally out of the area. He told nobody where it was.
And they still found it.
And they still found it.
Wow. Well, here's what I can't figure out. He shut down the machine, but why did the base become totally abandoned? Seems like the machine's gone, monsters disappeared.
This is an interesting point you bring up.
Yeah.
Preston insisted that the base was totally abandoned. Approximately 2 weeks after the 12th August shutdown date, was reported by another engineer who stayed hiding on the base and came to Preston about 6 months or more later. Actually came to Preston about 1986. I didn't meet the man, but Preston told me about him. That he had literally stayed on the base and hibernated there. He's afraid to move, to leave. He said he saw 1 week later a contingent of Marines come in with automatic weapons, and apparently had orders to kill anything that moved. Anything. So he said they went through and killed all, and the animals were there. Said there were apparently a few other people and himself there. They were all murdered. He kept sufficiently buried that he and one or two others survived it. The Marines left, and he said they watched them come in with some 26 truckloads of cement, out of cement trucks full of cement, and literally plug up every hole going into the underground, including the elevator shaft.
How many people do you think they killed?
I don't recall the figures that Preston came up with, but I think it was more than half a dozen. It was perhaps 20, as a guess now, okay. 20 or 30.
Now, where were you when they were doing all this shooting?
Off base. I was not back. And those who were still alive escaped and hid in someplace. And this guy turned up and looked on Preston's doorstep sometime around 1986 and told him his story. Preston checked out and found out there were a few others that had survived and escaped, and he found them and talked with them. And Preston's belief was that the entire operation was shut down. Now, there's one other person I know, as I've mentioned the name to you, in the name of Mark, who says, He says everything was not shut down. He says the entire surface was, but he said the underground kept operating for a year and a half after that. And he says, I was the one that shut the underground down. And he may be able to add a lot of enlightenment, but he says Preston is incorrect when saying that the whole base was shut down. He says it was not the whole base, it was the surface only. and any further operation on the surface, of which there was a lot, including administrative, was completely shut down, and how Mark kept going with the underground operations, which included, to some extent, some of the Montauk Boy operations, all of the trips out into, shall we say, space, wherever they went.
Mm-hmm.
He said that kept operating for another year and a half until it came to the point, he says, I decided we had to shut it down.
Does he talk about the Marines coming in and shooting everybody as well?
Mark did not. I've never asked him about that specific point. So you may ask him if he does come forward and does want to record.
Mm-hmm.
But it was not completely shut down. And there's some discrepancy in terms of what Mark has told me as to how important a position Preston held. He says Preston was there. He was an expert in certain areas, but he was not administratively as high up as he, Preston, likes to claim. This is Mark's statement. I have no way of knowing one way or the other. And if I did, I don't know if I'd want to get in the middle of that argument.
Yeah, I'm sure. But didn't you work with Preston?
Of course
while
I
you were
did.
There? So
I worked with Preston. I worked with Mark, though I cannot. Mark, of course, was not Mark at that time.
Mm-hmm.
I do not even yet recall what his name was originally, because what Mark told me was when he was ready to shut everything down, he had already selected his new parents, and he quite literally put himself, with automatic shutdown equipment afterwards, in a tunnel to be dumped in outer space, ending his life as whoever he was at that time. And then he came back and took over the new body, as it were.
Kind of like a walk-in thing.
As a walk-in.
Right.
He said he arranged that in advance. He said he chose it very carefully because he wanted to be able to be hidden. He didn't want them coming after him right away. He says he wanted to buy time, which he did. He bought a lot of time. Then he became involved in other government operations, which he eventually got out of. Now, at this time, they're trying to get him back.
Yeah, I know. I talked to him myself.
So time will tell how Mark comes out on this. Mm-hmm. He's a very sharp, very intelligent, very, very likable guy. Mm-hmm. And
he's a young guy right now.
Yes, he's quite young yet. I would say about 28, 30. Mm-hmm. Likes to drive high-powered cars. He's had a friend that he came up here to Atlanta to visit, who was working up here in Atlanta for a period of time, and then the friend left his job, moved to Florida, started up a new company, and this new company with his friend is the one that wants to hire Mark currently. Mark has been up to Atlanta more than once, and I know.
Well, so there's many times when you give lectures, Al, he'll sit at the table with you, right?
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, and answer a lot of questions.
Prior to that, I had a roommate who, before the time that I was his roommate, used to be at many of my lectures by my invite. He helped me hold down the table and helped me with the sales of various things.
Mm-hmm. How many other people, though, have come forward to you and say, "Hey, Al, I remember you. I worked with you," in addition to the three that we've talked about?
Quite a number. There's a man that I last talked with out in California. It was part of the Philadelphia experiment. He helped design the equipment to stabilize and synchronize the two big generators, because electrically they had to be in an exact phase relationship, and that was not an easy task. I've talked with him. He remembered me. There was a man who came to one of my lectures.
Do you remember his name?
I have it in my files, yes. I don't have it on the tip of my tongue at the moment.
Okay.
Another man came to me at one of the lectures and says, as you said, I remember you. I remember you because you were on board the USS Pennsylvania. He says, oh, were you on the Pennsylvania? He said, yes. I says, what was your position there? He says, I was the equivalent of what would be in civilian life the purser. He was the head of all records and the record keeping for all the personnel. I've forgotten what the Navy term is for that. But he says, do you remember the name Cameron on the roster? And he says, yes. I says, one or two. He says, I don't remember whether it's one or two, but he says Cameron was definitely on the roster, and it was in the time period you indicated on the Pennsylvania. He says, I was there then. Another person has come forward who was one of the engineers in the Department of Chemistry at Los Alamos Laboratories after the Philadelphia experiment was over and I was at Los Alamos. He definitely remembered me.
Do you remember his name? Hard to remember.
I do remember it, but not right at the moment.
Okay.
And I had dinner with him about a month ago.
Okay.
He still remembered. So one other man came forward who is still alive, living on Long Island. There's a man by the name of Alan Batchelor.
Mm-hmm.
He came forward and said he remembered the Philadelphia experiment. He remembered me. And he was one of the survivors, but he is still alive. He's quite old by now. He's up around 90. But he was also quite a ladies' man up till a few years ago, about 5 years ago. Boy, he wasn't chasing them. They were chasing him. And he didn't say no. So we had a good time right on up through that, like my father. I don't know how long my father kept active, but boy, he sure laid a lot of wild oats all over. And there probably are others, if I go back in my memory, that have come forward and said it, but there's quite a number have remembered me. And it's not a single isolated instance. There's quite a few.
It just happens over and over and over again.
It does.
Very common.
One of the others, of course, was Carl Allen. He died about 3 years ago. The man who was variously called Carlos Miguel Linda. He was in a retirement nursing home up in Greeley, Colorado. I finally found out from somebody where he was, and I called him, and he remembered me. He wouldn't say too much on the phone, but he says, Al, I would like you to come up here and visit with me. He wanted me to come visit him. Didn't have the money to go up there, and before I could get it together to go up there, I was advised that he had died up there. But he did remember me, and he did talk to some of the people, the inmates up there, and staff, that he had been part of the Philadelphia experiment. And when my book came out with the co-author, Brad Steiger, he used to talk about that book, and he used to show it around in the nursing home, from what I understand. I said, see, this is what I was involved in. I got that from another source, that he had the book and he showed it around.
So over the years, there's been several people.
Yes, there have been.
How about from Montauk as well, though? Have there been many in addition to Mark?
Yes, there have been a couple of people from Montauk, most of whom are still alive.
Right.
Living on the island, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And they figure in the background today of some of the research and have been involved with doing some of their own lecture work. And yes, they remembered me as part of it. And a couple of the Montauk boys I ran into remembered Preston, remembered me vaguely, but they did remember me. And what was most important, they remembered Montauk, the fact that they're involved in the Boys Project, and that one of them particularly had been so severely beaten, and he survived, but been so severely beaten he still had bruise marks on his shoulders from the beatings, and apparently he had suffered some impairment physically as a result.
So he remembered you. Was he mad when he saw you?
No, he wasn't, actually.
Where did he see you?
I'm sorry?
Where did he see you? Was it at a lecture?
No, this was when Preston took me to see him, either at his home or he came over to see Preston. For quite a while, there was a group of Montauk boys that sought Preston out for deprogramming, who remembered that they had gone through this thing, and
That's
the
strange.
reputation of Preston was up and down one end of the island to the other.
That's strange, because he programmed them, then they go to him to get deprogrammed.
Well, in a sense, he programmed them. He set up the protocols. The programming was done by Duncan initially, then it became partially electronic, then fully electronic. But he set up the basic programs because he had the access to the Wilhelm Reich notes and knew how to adapt that to the programming techniques, which later on became electronic. It was accessing the subconscious mind through various levels, and of course through this whole sex business of the sexual orgasm.
Okay, and we'll get into that in the Montauk section.
Right.
Okay, well, it's been an interesting 2 hours, Al. I appreciate your time and look forward to the next one.